Hello, everyone, and welcome to the One Canon podcast, your home on the Star Wars Underworld network for in-depth discussion on lore, the High Republic, and the whole canon of the galaxy far, far away. My name is Joel, and I'm coming from Underworld Orange County solo, not Han Solo, while Matthew takes a well-needed vacation this month. So, this week, canon. Unlike the Sith, where there are two, there is only one canon. So sometimes we include Visions and Legends, but we'll talk about that soon. And to discuss canon, transmedia, multimedia, whatever you like to call it, I brought the one, the only, the negotiator himself, Omar. Yay! Omar, how you doing?
Hello. I am doing really great. I'm super excited to talk about, again, one of my favorite subjects canon, media, transmedia, multimedia, the use of telling, uh, multiple different outlets in order to tell one singular story and how cohesive that is. One of my favorite subjects. So I'm super happy to be here and do that.
Woo! We are excited as well. Of course, a couple of plugs. Of course, a tractor beam I think will be happening this week. Let me check here. We will be doing, I believe, Inquisitors number 2, High Republic number 10, and High Republic Adventures number 8. So be on the lookout for that. Or you can follow us at Ion Cannon Pod, PYEONPOCANPOD. I'm doing the technical stuff this week, so hence why always seems to be a little bit weirder. But yeah, I think that's all the plugs. So let's get in. We're bringing back, of course, the week in Star Wars since we're done with Acolyte. So I'm bringing that back.
Right.
I'm bringing it back, as Vader would say. And to talk about a little bit of preamble to our One Canon discussion, my week has been, or where I talk about something I've been thinking about recently in Star Wars. I've been thinking a little bit about George Lucas and his relationship to the EU,
Mhm.
and how a lot of Lucas purists and weirdly people who also really want to defend the reboot, which I mean, I am pro that
Mhm.
decision too, but it's sort of like I think this argument always get tossed around. Um, bring up the fact that George never cared about the EU, and it's like he never considered the EU with work, and he brought it up, and you know, I mean, on the one hand, okay, that's fine. That is his right to not do that. But my big thing has always sort of been with that. It's like, especially from like Lucas purist people, it's like, buddy, George let it happen. George,
Mhm.
you let it happen. If you didn't want the EU discourse to proliferate the fandom discourse, then why did you let it happen? I mean, it's one thing if you want to consider Star Wars just his 6 films in the Clone Wars show. That's
Mhm.
fine. But George, buddy, you still let the books and the comics and the other stuff happen. I got the Essential Guide to Warfare in this bookshelf. And it
Right.
says the Essential Guide to Warfare, not asterisks, also includes the stuff that George Lucas did not consider canon. It starts 25,000 years in the past, has all the KOTOR stuff, and then gets into the original trilogy, and then after that, it's the Thrawn trilogy. As far as I'm concerned, that's marketing it as it's all one big thing. And, it,
Mhm.
and I've never understood this weird thing of George didn't like it. Why did you do it, man?
Mhm.
I mean, I've always known that Star Wars had a bit of a identity crisis back in the day of like independent movie then franchise, but still. But
Right.
anyway, Omar, would you like to respond to any of my opening rambling of the podcast?
Let me think. I mean, when I think of how George thought of the books and comics back then, I really think that's when he was probably the most businessman George that he could be. Like he really saw that as just a way to expand the market reach of Star Wars. Like, hey, I want Star Wars to still be alive and well. I want people to keep on talking about Star Wars. So to do that, I'm going to let other people expand on ideas that I will one day, expand upon myself, but, I'll put a few limitations on them by telling them you can't talk about this, you can't do that. But for the most part, he lets them do it, and I've always questioned like how much like he was involved in any of the processes, which I think is very little. I think he again just kind of saw it as a way to expand the Star Wars brand, so that he could continue for one, get more money, so that he can continue his many ventures into filmmaking and technology in filmmaking. And also for two, so that he could one day come back to the franchise. And there's still a pulse of Star Wars that is still there in the conscious of the people. Like that's all I really think he thought of that, of like the books and comics. And I think he thought of it as a pool of ideas that you know he could discard or use as he pleases. At least in my opinion, because like I do think what he liked Darth Talon, right? He liked Ayla
Uh,
Secura. He liked
yeah, in
Quinlan.
certain ways.
I don't know if Quinlan. I know, right? Quinlan, was Quinlan first in Phantom Menace or was he first in comics?
I think I think he was first in Phantom Menace in terms of that overall design, and then the comics just kind of ran with it.
Right, right, right.
If I remember
So
correctly.
see, it's examples like that that I really just think he um he had this pool of ideas that for the most part was just existing there to expand the brand, and he could do whatever he wants with it because he's the creator. He could use it or leave it. It doesn't matter. The Darth Talon one in particularly is like she was from a completely different time period. George, what were you thinking? I mean,
I like Twilight. Okay.
he really does. He really does. But yeah, no. Yeah, that's my answer to your week in Star Wars. I just think George had an interesting way of viewing it, and it was all through the lens of money and creative freedom for himself. Um,
Money. Um, George Lucas and the concept of death of the author is very much something that should I will probably one day make its own topic because that's a whole interesting thing, right?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. I agree. Yeah, it could be a whole different conversation we have.
Certainly. But with that being said, let us get on to the actual topic. The
Yes.
one true canon. I'm being facetious, by the way, folks out there who love legends and stuff like that. I just, like if there's two Sith, there's one canon. The one and the same. All right. So, Star Wars. Star Wars is a very interesting franchise, I think,
Mhm.
compared to all the other franchises out there. Because it's the one that has taken the idea of being a multimedia franchise almost to an extreme. Maybe
Mhm.
not extreme, but certainly to a um, definitely to a
To the most potential that it could be, maybe? Because I do think
probably.
it is the multimedia franchise, is what I
Oh,
would call it.
yeah, well, indeed. Like, all the other ones, either they're multiverses, like with DC or
Mhm,
Marvel,
mhm.
or with Star Trek and Doctor Who, it's like that. They don't really care that much about talking to each other,
Right,
even though it's technically in the same universe. But when Picard decides to ignore whatever Star Trek TNG books have been coming out, it's like, okay, yeah, we all know that's going to happen. Or Doctor Who
right,
like doesn't really adhere to the Big Finish stuff, or doesn't want to. Even when the actors themselves come back for Big Finish stuff, which I really like.
right.
But Star Wars has done this. It's done it as well as probably any franchise of this size can do it. Um, and no one else really tries this. Although James Gunn says he wants to try it, but he's got to just get focused on that one movie and we can get to other stuff later. Although there will be an animated Creature Commandos coming out this year, so tech, which is in the DCU. So I guess you're starting
Right.
somewhere.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so there's that. But I guess I'll toss this question to you, Omar, and that is maybe not the question of should every franchise try this, but more like what are some qualifiers for
Mhm.
a franchise or IP to try this method compared to like maybe like I don't know. I don't think like Twilight needs the multimedia franchise or Hunger Games needs one, but what
Right, right.
about like Star Wars? What are qualify Star Wars to get to do this? And what other franchise in terms of like world building stuff like that? What do you think you qualify you to try this method?
I don't know if that's the approach that I go for. I think it's just the idea that when a franchise wants to get as big as something like Star Wars or Harry Potter or something else like that, they almost have to go that route of expanding uh, in that way. because like I think George really set the stage for like a lot of franchises to follow up in that regard. So like the one that I'm currently thinking about is the new Avatar. The Avatar, as in not the blue people, the Last Airbender, and the upcoming shows, movies that are going to take place there. It already kind of has a little bit of a continuity with like comic books and books already, and with the introduction of these new media that is going to quite obviously bring in more viewers and more of a new audience, much more than those books and comics do. I think Avatar is kind of in this interesting space where it might just, I'm not going to say it's going to be the next Star Wars, but it is currently trying to do what Star Wars is doing. And so that's why my eyes are heavily on the Avatar franchise at the moment to see how that goes. Um, but yeah. So again, I really do just think like Avatar itself, it existed as just two TV shows, right? And then eventually, as you kind of like paid attention to it, they started releasing comics. The comics were just kind of there as like people who wanted more of the gang, they could go check out these comics. But then we started getting those Kyoshi novels that really pushed the envelope in terms of like, okay, now we're going to be exploring a completely new Avatar, and we're going to be able to see like how it was back then. They established things like that are set into this current canon. Um, Things that are now questionable, as if like, is the new stuff going to adhere to those kind of stuff? Like, these are questions that just come with, I think, a franchise that is going to build off itself in this way. And it's almost inevitable, I think, at this point for any kind of franchise that wants to adhere to like a singular canon, uh, that does this. So yeah, I guess to is there any qualifiers? I just think like if the franchise itself is like extremely popular, and if it's extremely popular, they're gonna want to tell more stories in different mediums in order to grow a market. And if that's the case, I think eventually there has to be a conversation within the ranks of the creatives as to what is canon and what is not canon. So I
I
don't know.
actually was
Yeah.
curious if those comics, those post Avatar Last Airbender comics, were going to count, or they were just going to reboot
Hmm.
afterward. Because they do like go into like the "Where's my mother" story and stuff like
Right.
that, and I always wondered like, oh, I thought they were just going to reboot that because like, wouldn't you want to tell that on
On the big screen. Yeah. No. See, it's such a big question. But from what I heard, like I think the Kyoshi novels are going to be taken into consideration with some of the newer shows and or movies or whatever, the newer content that is eventually coming that will be on the screen.
that
um
next year? I hope.
I think I need to double check, but yeah. So like so there's already some kind of like conversation going on as to about the elements that have been introduced thus far. um and yeah, so like there those conversations just tend to happen whenever we have these expansions in franchises like that. So yeah, I don't know. Did all that answer your initial
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
Because I will say that's something that I'm a bit more familiar with. I'm not familiar with Star Trek or Doctor Who, um, in any kind of capacity. So I don't know how they grew to be multimedia franchises. So maybe you could talk about that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, Doctor Who obviously had the big run from '60s to '80s. It had some tie-in comics, but like the thing is, with all these like tie-in comics and even some of the novel stuff, they
Right.
didn't really like want to make it like one singular canon. I mean, it was in a sense of like it's not like Marvel comics or Earth 616 in the video games or Earth 19587654321.
Right.
It's technically all counts, but it contradicts each other like all the time. Like
Yeah.
Big Finish contradicts the show, the book contradict Big Finish. There's a lot of Dalek origin stories depending on when it was written.
Right.
Doctor Who just contradicts itself sometimes, even within the show.
Right. Right.
It technically all counts in a we don't care because we're time travel and
Mhm.
stuff like that. So, but the show itself was never going to adhere to the books. or
Can I
comic book.
say I just to interject, I feel
Yeah,
like caring about continuity is maybe a more recent phenomenon. Do you agree with
that's true.
that?
Um, yes and no.
Okay, okay.
And then Star Trek, it's always sort of been movies and TV shows, and then sometimes we'll tell books. There was
Mhm.
a whole bunch of post Next Generation books, and then Picard happened. Picard was like, we don't care about those, so we're just gonna do our own thing.
Right,
Um,
right.
in terms of caring about continuity,
Mhm.
I think it's a thing depending upon continuity between mediums versus continuity within the media itself.
Mhm.
So I mean, go back to Star Wars and we saw this more with the '90s. Uh, the books themselves had a more or less coherent continuity
Mhm.
between them. Although there was definitely some struggle between how authors wanted to interpret certain things.
Right.
Um, but Luke establishes a Jedi Academy on Yavin. That stays as
Mhm.
part of as a world building thing
Right.
all the way up to the end until the reboot. So the books had their coherent continuity. Um, Books and comics though didn't really talk to one another. I mean, they kind of did, but that was more because Kevin J. Anderson was nice enough to include stuff from Dark Empire in his books.
Right.
So it's like Dark Empire could have easily just kind of been this one-off, almost otherworld thing. And Kevin
Mhm.
J. Anderson's like, nah, we're gonna tie it in with the Thrawn trilogy and my own thing, and
Mhm.
we're kind of so now it is all one thing.
Right. I think from what I'm getting at
Mhm.
is it seems like the choice to have something connect to another piece of media is always dependent on like a single creator that usually comes in and says, "Hey, I'm Kevin J. Anderson. I really like that comic or whatever that I also made have worked on. I'm going to connect to that and then make that kind of a connection like that." And it's also up to a
Yeah.
creator who will say, "Hey, you know what? I didn't really watch or experience all those previous things that were in this franchise, so I'm just gonna kind of create this to be its own or not a reboot, but like I guess I'm thinking of Picard because like I hear Picard didn't really acknowledge certain things, but it did like just kind of decide like I'm going to be a continuation of this, but not really regard some other things that were in existence. I think it always comes down to there is a creative, or if you want to be technical, like somebody higher up that just makes the call like, okay, we want to tell this story and we don't, and we either do want it to connect to something else or we don't, and that's kind of how continuity works, at least from what I
Yeah,
think.
more
Yeah.
or less. I would argue. I would say though, at least with Star Wars,
Mhm.
it's around the 2000s that things started to get a little more coordinated.
Right.
You
Yeah.
have all NGO and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Um,
NJO, I think, probably had such a big part of that, I think.
Definitely. Although comics and books still weren't talking to one another until
Right. The
uh,
Bantam era and Dark
well, no, the best
Horse.
Del Rey by then.
Oh, Del Rey. That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would say Star Wars today, at the very least, books and this is why we do paper canon, screen canon. Books and comics and everything that's not released on screen talk to one another far more. Um, at least inherently, right? Because Star Wars that one's coming out
Right.
in a few weeks, and it's like they got Crimson Dawn in there and Kira, and it's like, oh, that's from the comics. That's from
Right.
like it's because of course, gotta be there because in this particular time period. So it's like, yay,
Yeah.
there's some communication happening, whereas
Right.
um, Doctor Who, the things don't really talk to one another. Star Trek things don't talk to one another. I'll be curious to see where if Avatar decides, are we going to have these things talk to each other or not?
Mhm.
Um, and again, with James Gunn, I'll be curious to see if he wants to try and have various media talk to one another
Right. Because I
outside of the movies and shows.
from my understanding, like if we're even talking about DC or Marvel, like what their current projects like the MCU and whatnot, like they're very selective as to like what counts and what kind of doesn't count. Like there have been things that have been questionable, I understand. Um, and I know like even if something is animated, it doesn't always mean it's gonna be part of that universe. So like, yeah, there's always a lot of factors. Like even as far as mediums, what medium can count in part of this universe, and will these stories be adhered to for the next creator in line to create these things?
Oh yeah, Marvel. It's like we're jumping to different franchises. But okay,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
okay. I'm fine.
Yeah,
I'm fine with
just
that.
just to talk about like
Oh
in
yeah.
terms of like canon and how they have utilized these multimedia, stories. I think it's important to talk
Oh
about
yeah.
a few other franchises just to get a good comparison for Star Wars.
Well, Marvel's interesting, and I guess we should look at Marvel because that's kind of the big thing right now.
Hmm.
The MCU is not in the same world of the comics. It's a different universe, a
Right.
multiverse, which has always been the case. I mean, like God, I don't know what if you used to watch old Marvel cartoons like Avengers, Earth's Mightiest Heroes, or Spider-Man cartoon.
Not
Um,
those, but X-Men Evolution, which
okay,
is pretty standalone, I would say.
yeah, so that's its own universe.
Mhm.
I know technically the Spider-Man show, Spectacular Spider-Man and Avengers Earth Mighty Heroes were like in part of the same universe, kind of doing their own
Right.
DCAU thing.
I mean,
Um,
hey, if you want to talk DCAU, that's my first exposure to anything that connected in that sense of a way. Not necessarily outside of mediums, but different shows that maybe you didn't initially think would have connected, and how much Bruce Timm, and
r-
Alan Burnett were involved in each of these projects. Like I know Static Shock, I don't think was really involved too much with either, or
he
maybe
had
like
a
one
couple
was a producer.
cameos with Batman in there
The,
and Joker.
no,
So
Static Shock did cameos with like each and every DCAU, like Justice League, Superman, Batman.
Batman
Uh,
Beyond.
yeah, it was even confusing because like for the Batman crossover, they'd use like the Batman art style from his show, and then Justice League when Batman would appear, they're using Batman's Justice League outfit, and it's like, wait a minute, these animation styles don't make sense. But like, who cares? Because like, it's just like from Static Shock's point of view, they're just kind of tying into any other DC property there is.
I
So
think with things like the DCAU and with the MCU,
right,
that's a situation of we're not doing we're what's going to sound weird to say, but we're not that ambitious.
right,
The MCU, the only thing that really ever counted was the movies. They
right.
said Agents of Shield counted, but they gave up by the second
They
movie.
did, they did.
They
Yeah, yeah.
they are now trying to they're kind of retconning the Netflix shows back into it,
Right.
but that's because Daredevil's the
Because
biggest
they're
thing ever, and people love Daredevil. So that's a situation of these Netflix shows were always more popular than Agents of Shield, so we're gonna more or less retcon them back in, and
mhm,
we'll finagle anything that kind of maybe doesn't completely line up. But yeah, more or less those Netflix shows count, kind
right,
of same actors.
right.
More or less same storylines, kind of. So it's like, yeah, we're gonna fold them back in. Um, just what some of the later Star Wars stuff tried to do with some of the earlier Star Wars stuff pre the '90s with the Marvel
Right.
comics, and that's how you get Darth. What's that Darth Lady, the Sith lady,
Lumia,
Jason Statham.
Lumia,
Yeah,
Lumia,
Darth Luminia,
or
who
Lumina,
was
something
like
like that. Yeah,
who appeared in the comics. Then the
yeah,
Marvel comic didn't count anymore, and then she got brought back in. So like,
yeah.
okay, now they kind of count again.
They kind of count. Yeah, yeah, yeah. See, that's
So
always a fun aspect of it. Because
I
it
think that's
probably a writer said, "Hey, I want to use this character from the Marvel comics," and they're like, "Oh, that's kind of a lower thing, but you know what? We'll allow it." And that's how we get examples like that, probably.
yeah. I don't know how that happened, but it did.
Yeah,
But with Marvel and DCAU, it's like okay, DCAU only counts because with the shows there were some DCAU tie-in comics, but those never counted because those always get retconned in. Um,
yeah. I mean,
so
shout out to one of my favorite YouTubers. What are the Watchtower Database? They talk all about DCAU specifically and whether or not certain things canon within that franchise.
Right. So that's very much a situation, at least for me, of I'm only really counting the on-screen stuff because I know that
Yeah,
they will retcon any continuing comics or stuff like that. And with Marvel's case, Marvel doesn't even try to have like tie-in video games. And technically, I mean, they have the streaming shows, which are just at this, which yeah, yes and no.
right.
That's a weird middle ground area that I don't really want to. It's
I
kind of hard
mean,
to count,
if you want to be
but
technical, they make a point to say the streaming shows count. Like,
oh no, I know that. I mean, I'm just
yeah,
like I'm just saying, like, they're shows, but they're
The
not really
shows.
TV.
Oh, I see
In
what you're
that,
saying.
it's sort of that hybrid
Yeah,
movie thing, which I always go on about. But like
yeah.
those count, but
Mhm.
there's not like an ongoing, there's no like ongoing Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man happening, or
Right,
like here's a couple novels set in between Age of Ultron and
right.
Thor: The Dark World, stuff like that. Where with Star Wars,
Mhm.
there are those things, and there are those, and they're somewhat talking to each other. I mean, obviously, when it comes to on screens, it depends on who the author is for sure. But at
Yeah,
least it does feel like you're trying to expound and expand upon certain things.
right.
Whereas Marvel and with Marvel, at least, it's like, nah, here's the movies. There's no anything else. And James Gunn's only now just starting his universe, so who knows where that will go? Even if he's still going to have Elseworld stuff.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, yeah. No, no doubt, no doubt. I
but I
agree with
think
that.
But yeah, I think we've gone over all the franchises. I think again, I'd be curious to see how Avatar, if we want to take the true Star Wars route, like no books, comics, it's like a Zuko movie and then a Zuko tie-in comic in between Zuko movie 1 and 3.
Right, right.
That'd be interesting. But I guess we'll move to the second kind of part of the discussion of
Yes.
how a multimedia project like Star Wars should be used to the most
Mhm,
effect.
mhm.
And I've always kind of viewed it, um, weirdly, how we talk about Jordan Lucas in a weird way,
Uh-huh.
but obviously with a bit more, obviously, of maybe even the screen authors, as much as as much as creative freedom they get, they
Mhm.
still have a certain responsibility now to the wider IP of. I've always seen the screen stuff, movies and the TV shows, kind of the animated shows in the gray area. I'll get into
Mhm.
that as that's where the franchise grows. That's where it expands. That's where you bring in new people.
Mhm.
That's where that's kind of where the new folks have come in. The two big examples, of course, have always been the Mandalorian
Mhm.
and Force Awakens as
Right.
the sort of the two big examples of franchise explosion. So many new people coming in,
Yeah.
and then as we call it on here, paper canon. Books, comics. We also include video games. Again, that's a gray area.
Mhm.
Of
Right.
that to me is where you maintain your fandom. That's where it's like, I mean, if if new people come in through books and comics, that's great. Obviously, I'm sure there are examples out there of I got into Star Wars through the books, and that's completely valid. And that's totally cool.
Right. Right.
But
Yeah.
I've always sort of seen it as, and the way they marketed it as okay, you like Star Wars this movie, here maybe go deeper dive, try out this Star Wars book, try this Star Wars comic run. Kind of keeps the current fandom iteration,
Mhm.
sustained until the next kind of mega thing hits, which is a
Yeah.
streaming show or a movie. I again with streaming shows are a little harder to gauge because of how
Mhm.
numbers work, and I don't understand it.
Right.
But
Right.
we're just gonna go with on-screen live action stuff for now. But what do you think, Omar? Do you think that's sort of the way it, if
Yeah.
not should work, does work?
Yeah. No, it that is pretty much how it works in my head as well. For one, I think much like you, I do separate it into on-screen canon or on-screen material and then paper material. And it very much is like people discover them through movies because it's just a simple fact that there are more people that experience the Star Wars movies than there are people that read Star Wars books. Um, I don't even have to do that much digging to confirm that. I think
Oh,
uh, it's just a lot of in terms of like what gets experienced more. Uh, People are watching TV shows and movies just more so than they are currently reading or reading comics or anything. Not that that's a good or bad thing. It's just how I think it goes, and it has been going for a very long time. So naturally, like the way it goes is like you find a character you really like. I really like Luke Skywalker. I want to read more books about Luke Skywalker. Or actually not even books. I just want to know stories about Luke Skywalker. I want to learn more about Luke Skywalker. So I look up and there's a comic book about him. There's these books about him. All of a sudden it's like information about the world, the characters are kind of commodified. Is that the right term? It just like they start to become uh bits of something to give more to an audience that just wants more out of uh the stories that they experience. So all of a sudden there are more, not more movie because that's very expensive, but there's more comics, there's more novels, so that's how I see the pipeline existing for sure. um
Yeah.
yeah.
Again, video games and animated, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts. Video games and animated shows, though, are like this weird gray area, at least for me,
Right.
because unfortunately, we still live in a world where animation is not appreciated, and the
Mhm.
best stuff ever is animated. Um, so kind of like I don't know if Bad Batch is greatly growing the Star Wars franchise, same way I
Right.
even felt like Clone Wars didn't,
Uh-huh.
kind of more sustained it. But then the weird opposite trend, video games are always huge, man. Like video games
Yeah.
are
Oh,
the second coming
absolutely.
to movies.
Yeah.
But then they got the same problems too with production and needing to learn to scale and problems like that. But I know I had some friends who I had a friend who like me. Hey, I have a friend who like really like KOTOR games, and they probably know the most about the Star Wars universe via the Jedi Fallen Order trilogy duology at this point than
Right.
keeping up with the books and comics. So that to me is that gray area. I'm curious if you would agree with that.
So I already kind of count the animated shows and live action TV shows and video games all as, on screen canon. But you're right. Like, there obviously is this difference between how the films are treated. Like, films are very clearly ranked higher. This all goes into the hierarchy of canon that I believe still exists. I think even though like that official one that was created all back in the day, that no longer exists. But I think really the one I mean kind of always has existed in that you have the on-screen canon and then paper canon, and one informs the other. Whenever a film comes out, you'll have these tie-in materials that will always be there. Uh, that for people that want to explore more. Now, for animation and video games, because I consider them mini versions of that, to where like you had Rebels tie-in books and comics, that existed there for them, much the
Interesting.
same way as there was, the Force Awakens tie-in books and comics. There were a few, actually, yeah, no, there was for Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. I think there were tie-in material for both of them, like one comic and then one book. So like yeah, so there I think that effect that we see in regards to on-screen and paper, that still is there for both animation and and video games. Although granted, not for all of them. Like Bad Batch, I think is yet to have like a proper
They
tie-in
haven't done tie-in stuff for
in a
the shows
while,
in a while.
and I think because
Acting like something that's one.
right, right, exactly. It's such a huge deal that Acolyte's getting them. So, like, I think the reason for that is because they've kind of moved their paper canon to be like High Republic focused. At least that's what I'm thinking. I feel like if High Republic wasn't happening, which I'm glad it very much is happening, but if it wasn't happening, I think we would still have quite a lot of tie-in materials for all the things that probably would have gotten tie-in materials like Book of Boba Fett, Mandalorian, all this stuff. I just think a lot of resources are being put into High Republic and whatnot. But that aside, though, they still had time to like make these tie-in materials for the Jedi Survivor and the Jedi Fallen Order. The Jedi series. They had time to do that, and at a point we did have stuff that did connect to Rebels. Um, so yeah, I see them all as just on-screen canon that there is some kind of creator that is a central that is at the center of each one. It could be like a team of writers or whatever, but that create that story, and then later on, Lucasfilm will look at that story and say, how can we expand? How can we tell a story about this character from that story? How can we expand an element from that story? And thus, that informs the paper canon that has. And
This,
it. Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna ask. Do you think I'm asking to ask you this question, and we've talked. Anyway, I think we talked about this when Dave became the CEO not chief operating officer, chief creative officer.
Right.
Do you think that in some ways by doing that, that's also story group handles more paper, and then kind of Davis CCO handles more on-screen coordination? Would you argue that? I mean, I'm sure there's more than just him, but
Yeah, I mean, that's a
that's
question that I don't think
that's
anyone's qualified to answer except for those people that are in the room where it
that's true.
happens.
That's true.
I don't truly know. Like, I even to this day, I kind of have a little bit of difficulty putting into words what exactly the story group did. And like, not to say they didn't do anything. I think it's very clear they had the job, and then they were able to maintain a lot of the brand and a lot of probably the story. But to what extent and to how much of it was just a basic marketing team that was just keeping consistency among like brands, among its brand. I think it's really hard to say. You know, um, yeah, I don't fully know. Um,
Yeah, because like
but
I read interviews with like Leslie Headland talking about like, oh yeah, I talked to Dave about like the witches and how they're different from the Night Sisters, and
right.
like me, Pablo, Dave, we all got our heads together when it's like we wanted Plagueis in here, and that's why he's the way he is. And
See, it all feels very informal, and not to say it needs to be formal, but it feels like, hey, I wanted this thing to happen. I talked to the people I know would have the power to make it happen, and I
mhm,
made it happen. So that's kind of what I mean when it's like it's very creator focused. Like there's a creator who wants to have references in their story, and they'll make it happen. And all of a sudden, we have this connectivity among the story itself. But that is not something that needs to always happen because it depends on the creator, like um and it depends on like teams within the story that want to add these extra elements to it. Like in comparison to like Andor, like I really don't think Gilroy was too like, oh, I really want to have all these references in here. But maybe someone on like the props team was like, I'm gonna add this thing that is in connection to this other thing, and all of a sudden you have that little bit of connectivity that a lot of people on Twitter foam at the mouth for, and that's great, it really is. But it's also like, I think maybe some of the stuff is really mystified, and we don't really know what goes into how much connectivity there is in these stories.
well, that's actually something interesting about Andor as well for like kind of two big things. The first big thing is season two is going to be running up right against Rebels, and
right.
Tony Gilroy's working in a time period that's already kind of been it's I don't know oversaturated, but it's got stuff in there. It's not like an empty field.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, for
and
sure.
but also to go to your point about the individualism of it all, Tony Gilroy did talk about like yeah he did the research. He went to Wikipedia. He looked up stuff.
Mm,
He
right,
once
right,
even
right,
schooled an interviewer of when Mon Mothma of the right time period when Mon Mothma left the Senate after the Gorman massacre.
right,
Um,
right, right.
so it's like, well, clearly he's doing the research itself, and that's another thing I think is interesting about connectivity and canon of it all is like I think what's also kind of interesting was like what we saw with the sequels and what we're kind of seeing with the Mandoverse is, and what we're hopefully going to see with the Rey film and Dawn of the Jedi movie, Force God willing. Um, those are creatives who got a lot of wiggle room to kind of do whatever they like. Like we could talk about, like, oh, JJ didn't do the X, Y, and Z, but like he had no wrong. There were no wrong answers for the sequels. He had a whole
Right.
era to do whatever the heck he wanted. He didn't have to worry about contradictions or canon or whatnot per se.
Yeah.
He was working in an empty field.
No, you're right.
Mandoverse is also kind of working in an empty field. Like, yeah, it's got to worry about the sequels, but also kind of doesn't because the sequels are still a couple decades away.
Right.
And Dawn of the Jedi is 25,000 years away. So as
Yeah.
long as the
Yeah.
Jedi get established, there are kind of no wrong answers here. Um,
Very true. Yeah.
so it's kind of interesting seeing what I guess maybe also dealing with creatives who want to work in a more I don't know if saturated is the right word, but more developed era of the timeline compared to those who are working in more of an empty, underdeveloped one.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think. See, I really do think like this hierarchy of canon that we've already kind of talked about and expressed. Um, what it really boils down to, what really builds it, is how much creative freedom are we going to give to each of these creators that we want to work with, Lucasfilm, like that Lucasfilm wants to work with. And whatever that decision is, it informs the story and it informs the possibility of connections. So like if you're a franchise writer, and it's like I've seen interviews about people like franchise writers that write novels in I think I remember one that was like a Halo writer who wrote some of the novels and stuff. Um, not Karen Travis, not her,
She
but
wrote for Halo.
yeah she really did.
Honestly, that seems like her field.
No, for sure. Like I was talking to a friend and I recognized the name. I'm like, and anyway, so yeah, they were kind of really going into it of like, it's kind of expectant to to really play ball when you're a franchise writer, because you have to you really have to adhere to a lot of what someone else's story is. So you have to write around that in a very creative way, um, and still show your own voice in that narrative. Um, that's something that you can't say the same for someone like J.J. Abrams, who came in and says, I want this story to be this kind of way, and I'm going to bend whatever I need to do in order to make this story be how I want it. They have much more creative freedom than someone who is going to be writing a tie-in novel or comic series within a specific period of time. And that's just the truth. And I know a lot of people don't like that truth, because I think they really do see it as like every creative that should be coming in, whether it is a novel writer or a comic book writer or a filmmaker, should have the same amount of creative freedom. And I can't think of a time where maybe that was ever true in Star Wars' history. The closest maybe is the New Jedi Order, and that's only because that just wasn't that era just wasn't being utilized. And they're doing the same thing right now with High Republic. Like that little space of era just wasn't being utilized. So they said, okay, we're gonna have a bunch of creatives together and just go ham on this like specific era. And I think it's genius. It was great. They did the thing again, like along with New Jedi Order. Like instances like that are so great, because finally we can have moments where we give that creative freedom that is normally reserved for creatives in different mediums like film and TV. Now all of a sudden we give that to paper cannons people. So that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Although again, this is sort of the mysticism of it all. There has to be some sort of the powers that be, even for the filmmakers. I mean, we know Colin Trevorrow definitely had to deal with that. He got the boot. They didn't like what he was
at that
doing.
point, it's a different game. I would say it's the filmmaking Hollywood game of all of a sudden, like like how are you gonna? Oh, actually, no, you're right, because that specific moment was like they were kind of going against the Force and all that. No, yeah, you're right. You're right.
And I do have to think that, even although maybe this is just the initial pitch, it's like Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni. I mean, they probably wouldn't do this, and John probably wouldn't do this either. But let's just pretend they would. They can't go completely out there with like in between episodes 6 and 7. The Yuzong Vong invaded and trashed the galaxy, and it destroyed Coruscant and half the core worlds or something like that. Like they could not go that crazy. You still have to adhere to 7 and 9. Although I get that's just kind of Dave's thing of like, I'm the interconnector or sword, so that's probably why he's doing it.
I think the probably more creative freedom is probably more so like, what are you going to do with Luke? In between this period, like what are you gonna what kind of story about Luke Skywalker are you gonna tell that we got to be careful for?
Well, that's actually kind of the next point I wanted to make about this particular section in terms of multimedia is. I always one of the things I always talk about, or maybe think about, is okay, why are we telling this on screen compared to telling this into a book and comic?
Yeah.
Because I am someone who believes that if you're telling something on screen, that's because you want the most people to retroactively think differently about your thing compared to compared to your on your comics and books to a certain extent. So like if it's in a comic book, like you're not retroactively changing too much of how we view a point in time or the history or the overarching meta story in a sense,
Right.
right? Like if the prequels were told as novels, then that means like okay, the original trilogy can kind of stand on its own, not really need to be recontextualized that much. But the prequels were told in movies, then the original trilogy gets recontextualized, Star Wars itself gets recontextualized,
Right.
and etc. etc. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why we think about, the day when we pulled the trigger on the Luke Skywalker story, be it live action, even animation to a certain extent, we deal with,
Right.
whether or not we deal with recasting or not. Um, to me, it's like, okay, are we going to tell the story? I'm just going to say on screen, so we don't have to deal with like, just recast or
Yeah.
animated,
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
on
Yeah. Yeah.
screen because we want to recontextualize to a certain degree,
Mhm.
not we're going to erase the Last Jedi because Ruin Johnson
Right.
sucks. Yeah, but
Yeah.
recontextualize it in a way because we want the massive audience to kind of then review or re-watch um,
Last
the
Jedi.
Last
Yeah.
Jedi, even the whole
Even
sequel,
this, the whole
right? Right,
sequel, really.
the
Yeah.
entire sequel in a different light.
Yeah.
Or are we going to tell it in books and comics because we think that those stories stand on their own enough and tell what they need to tell enough that we don't need to recontextualize it. It's fine the way it is.
Right.
And that's just the Luke Skywalker story. I could probably go on like they although who knows back in the early days with Aftermath where it's sort of like we didn't see the fall of the Empire. It just kind of happened, and now Mandoverse is kind of dealing with the aftermath, which
Right.
the aftermath. Ha ha ha. But
Yes.
I guess my question, I'll toss that to you,
Uh-huh.
Omar, in terms of your thoughts of like, do you ever think that like when it comes to certain stories, they also are a little like, okay, should we tell this on screen or should we tell this on paper, and what does that say about kind of I guess the importance of this particular concept?
Hmm. I'm a little split on it because I definitely see what you're saying. I also just think that like how at least Lucasfilm has thus far given like movies to people, they've kind of just tapped on filmmakers' shoulders and say, "Hey, what kind of story you want to tell? Oh, you want to tell a rogue squadron, like very personalized, fighter, story? Yeah, let's go ahead and tell that kind of story." Um, and not necessarily going into it like, "Oh, I want you to tell this kind of story, and we're gonna have you do this kind of thing." I mean, all except for the sequel trilogy, which I think very much was done like that. Hey, we want to tell this kind of story. Let's start tapping shoulders of, filmmakers that are have been inspired by Star Wars, young filmmakers that are kind of the up and coming big thing that we want to tap on their shoulders and kind of give them this opportunity. They're still doing the whole tapping on the shoulder thing, but I do think a lot of it is just like, hey, what kind of story do you want to tell? Um, if you want to tell this story, okay, let's kind of make it happen. It's so much creative freedom. Even at the initial part, it's just kind of asking them like, hey, what kind of story do you want to make?
So I'll say this though, I have heard that Solo was not like Lawrence Kasdan's idea. It was more like, hey, we got this Solo concept. You want it? So
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's sort of the opposite.
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And also Rogue One, I think, was a concept that John Knoll had
yes.
prior to the yeah, yeah, yeah. So no, I definitely get it. I agree. So it does sound like they're I think it sounds like they've already had like certain concepts for movies in
Dawn of the Jedi is another one I know.
Oh,
They
is that
almost gave
another
that.
example?
Yeah, they
Oh,
almost
okay,
gave it to
okay.
the Game of Thrones dudes. That's apparently what theirs was going to be.
Oh, okay, okay. So then that kind of throws a little bit of wrench, but like also not in a negative way in any sort of sense. But no, yeah, I think I definitely see where what you're saying is to like, oh, do they want this kind of story to be on screen or whatnot? Like if there's something like a Luke Jedi Academy story. Like, I do wonder if they've had the conversation. Do we want this to be a book series, like in inspiration of Kevin J. Anderson and his trilogy of Jedi Academy stories, or like I could see them going that route. I could also see them saying, "Hey, this is something that's big. We kind of want to change perception on how the Last Jedi is e- viewed, I guess." And they want
Kylo Ren
to
himself.
kind
I
yeah,
think so.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so we want to kind of like create this. Like in my opinion, if you ask me, I want it to be an animated thing because I don't want any kind of weird AI deep fake stuff
Or
going
just the
on.
drama of recasting.
Yeah. I mean, hey, you could throw in Mark Hamill and be the, he could be the voice. He's a voice actor. I think he would like to play an older Luke in that regard. And um, Last Jedi was already a story where, like, what they were doing with Luke, a lot of it is implied, like how he got there. I mean, it's implied and also full on said, but um, all the things that were implied we could literally just spell it out in like an animated show like that. So in that regard, like, I just as a fan, I hope it's an animated show, or on screen. It's an on screen show, but yeah, I don't know, because I don't truly know what would dictate whether or not something needs to be on screen or not. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I
No,
elaborated a
I
bit more
I
about it.
think
So
I think it's an interesting idea, right? Because like I think of some of the concepts that we've been seeing on screen and off screen, and I'm like, for the most part, I've been pretty agreeable
mhm.
with what we've seen on screen. Maybe like Solo's like the only exception. Like, I don't really care, but that's
Right.
just
I mean,
me.
have you ever had a story, a TV show where it's like, oh, this could have been a novel, or this could have been a comic book series? I hear sometimes that complaint sometimes. Well, maybe not in a while, but I've heard stuff like that where it's like, man, this could have been a really great, you know, novel series instead of a 8 episode TV show, or stuff like
In
that.
in the context of Star Wars, I mean, I've definitely done the whole. It should have been a movie, but
Yeah,
in terms
yeah,
of like
yeah,
on
yeah.
screen itself, like no, because like Kenobi for me very much is honestly like that bridges the episode 3-4 gap
Right.
in a lot of great ways for me.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, Acolyte, I mean, I love Acolyte. That's sort of doing an episode 0 thing. If it
Right.
continues, it's really going to help out, I think. And I guess Book of Boba Fett. Book of Boba Fett got its own problems.
Yeah.
And Mandalorian is kind of like telling us a new saga almost, an in between saga.
Mhm.
I call it the Thrawn saga. Um, so to me, that is very much like it's kind of its own separate. It's kind of like it's a saga in between sagas in a way.
Right. Right.
And then Rogue One, obviously that is the prequel to A New Hope. So
Right.
like maybe Solo, I guess, is kind of the closest, but it's
Is the
like
closest that. See, I had the mentality that those standalone films, anthology films, whatever they were called, back when they were being
it's the
created,
Star Wars
and
story.
not exactly, and not stopped abruptly. Um, I always had the idea like, oh, these are stories that are going to be smaller in scale, even though Rogue One very much wasn't smaller in scale, or they were stories that would have been that could have been like legends novels, or just any kind of canon novel, uh, brought to life, like a concept that probably would have been delegated to a type of on paper canon story, just brought to life onto the big screen. And I remember thinking like, that's a pretty cool concept. Like, it doesn't have to be like galaxy changing stories. It could be if it wanted to, but like, it could also just be what Solo was. And I remember thinking that concept was a very cool concept. I'm like, I could get behind that. And I think that eventually evolved into what we have with the Disney Plus shows. Um, Granted,
And even the movies, probably to a certain extent. Like I don't expect
yeah,
that Ray film to be that big. Hopefully,
that's true. That's true. So like, it comes to a point where it's like, does it even really matter what kind of story gets told on screen or on paper? The only aspect that matters is what fans would probably complain about, and like, and
uh,
I'm not like immune to that either. I probably would complain if I found out that Luke's story was going to be, books instead of an animated TV show, because I have wants, I have wants and needs. But yeah, I think that's the only aspect that really like would challenge anything. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's like, really any story can be told anywhere, truly, right?
I I mean, I think in a perfect world, yes, in a perfect world where we treated all the media as equals.
Yeah,
But
but
there's
that's not
that
true.
part of me that's not true. But there is that part of me that's like, if I feel like the reputation, I mean, maybe not, I don't know. But I don't know. But it's like I feel like in some ways, the reputation of the in between 6 and 7
Mhm.
would probably not be as widespread if it were live action shows or just shows in general, and kind
Right.
of creating that bridge gap. Which because I want as many people as possible to feel like there's finally that bridge between 6 and 7, because
Right.
there wasn't for a long time.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and if they did a Luke Skywalker show, even if it's animated, I think they'd probably still keep an eye on it. I think that would get enough. Maybe could retroactively change the discourse. I mean, there's only going to be people who. I mean, we can talk about this later.
Right.
But
I
in
mean, no,
terms,
no, no. Yeah, no, this is part of the conversation because I mean,
yeah,
let's talk about Palpatine. I mean,
yeah,
look what's going on with Palpatine. I mean, they're doing a lot to sow the seeds, and this is like in Bad Batch, is to like this plan to always have been there. Bad Batch is one example, but of course, there's stuff in the comic books and whatnot. But Bad Batch is
Mandoverse,
particularly, yeah, in
particular
the
for me.
Mandoverse, they're already sowing the seeds of what eventually is. And these are stories that have been in production for years, particularly Bad Batch, particularly because animation takes such a long time. Like it wouldn't surprise me if right after the Rise of Skywalker, like a year or so maybe, because like they were still working on Clone Wars. Actually, no, Clone Wars was probably already almost finished by the time Rise of Skywalker came out. So, yeah, like by the time Bad Batch was being conceptualized, I wouldn't be surprised if they had this idea of, okay, we're going to connect like the Palpatine storyline into it. And I know a lot of people don't like that because they don't like the Star Wars, they don't like the Palpatine returning thing. But that's how transmedia works because the way transmedia is, it's a yes and kind of thing where every creator adds on to a tapestry that already exists. Um, like it's not going to be a perfect tapestry where everything aligns, but at the very least, they're not going to full on say the sequel trilogy did not happen, right?
Right.
No one's going to come out and do that. No creator jumping into a franchise is going to do that because that would be just completely incoherent for the brand. Like it'd be such a bad idea. Um,
No, I agree. So, I mean, that's a good place to continue the pros and cons section. Well, we're kind of already talking about
yep.
it, but I'll ask
Yeah.
this one more question because it's something you brought
Yeah.
up in terms of them
Go ahead.
tapping creatives for ideas. Another one though that I would challenge you on is the Ray
Okay.
film itself, because I just get the sense that that is we the studio know that we kind of screwed up a little bit with the Rise of Skywalker. We really want to kind of give Ray another chance in maybe a more popular
Right.
movie. Um, that's another one where I feel like that was probably like the studio had this idea. Hey, David Lindelof, can you do this? And then we're
Right.
like, we're not quite sure. It's getting Steven denied, and also Shrimo Bachinoy wants a bit more creative freedom. Because we
Right.
very much don't want another solo situation.
Right. Right.
Um, but I do think that's another one where the studio kind of came up with like, we got to do something with Ray. She's still the future. We got to think of
It's still
something.
the future. We got to think of something. Yeah, no, I can understand that aspect to it. I think I'm always like a little bit down whenever like there are concepts of like, oh, they're changing trajectory because of fan backlash. Because I really hate the idea of fan backlash being a motivator to change things. Ever since a lot of people said, oh, that's the reason why the Rise of Skywalker came out this way. When I think there's much more factors than that created why the Rise of Skywalker is the way it is. Um, yeah, no. But you're probably right. There probably is like this idea of like we really want Ray to encompass this idea of the next generation. So we're going to keep on doing that. Although that raises the question, like I heard about early drafts of the script and how it was an older Ray, and now all of a sudden that's the next generation. But it sounds like maybe some interference happened, and they said, "Hey, no, we got to keep Ray young. She has to be like who was the actress again that they were thinking about?
Helen Mirren.
Ellen, yeah. That would have been interesting. That would
Yeah,
have been very interesting.
I heard that, and it also just seemed to me that they wanted to. I mean, this is kind of what I heard from the grapevine of
Yeah,
they
grapevine
wanted
talk.
they
Yeah,
wanted to avoid another solo situation where the writer and director were clearly not eye to eye. And then when they brought in Sharimo Bachinoy, they're like, Lucasfilm, like, okay, we're gonna side with the director because she's gonna be kind of the one in charge.
right.
And they Lindelof, thank you for your services. We're gonna get a different writer, and Steven Denight apparently and the director are a lot more tight and collaborative with each other in terms of
Yeah.
kind of going in a singular direction for whatever the film will be. So,
Right.
um,
Right.
you
Right.
know,
Right.
so there's
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
probably that too. So it's like Chiwetel Ejiofor is the driving force here. He is not really left.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean, if we're being very honest, like even the Mando and Grogu is probably because of how big the Mandalorian has done. Like it's not fan backlash that motivated it. It's just the fact that it was fan praise that probably motivated them to say, let's make a movie out of these guys.
oh,
um,
totally.
and yeah, that makes sense. They want to follow the market.
And I'm
They
okay with
want
that too.
to. Yeah, I'm pretty okay with that, depending on how much stuff gets messed with in terms of the creatives. But I know it's a very cutthroat industry, so yeah.
It seems like John is fine with it, and they
Yeah,
probably can get that out quick.
yeah, for sure. At the end of the day, all these guys are rich, so
Yeah. But yeah, let's kind of get into the pros and cons of multimedia franchise storytelling, and
sure.
because I do think there are cons as much as we have been praising it. And there are pros,
Right.
lots of pros. But I mean,
Yeah.
obviously the biggest pro, and it's the one we started talking about, is yeah, you can expand your universe and the lore, and you're
Right.
not kind of confined to just having to wait for a movie. The MCU, as much as it's the biggest thing, it's also kind of limiting because sort of like it's just the movies and the streaming shows.
Right.
Kind of like the world is not that big and expansive, even though it's big and expansive. Where
Right.
with Star Wars, like you get a movie, and then it's like, hey, that weird thing, the weird planet. Like here's a book trilogy about that, and you can really
About
dive
that.
into that. Or
Right.
random dude with three eyes, he can have a own comic book series if you want. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And
or
I kind of
Phasma, who was
exactly. I kind
yeah,
of just real quick. I think back to the origins of kind of Star Wars, and like how it very much was tied into like the marketing in itself, like with toys that people waited for, and like um memorabilia and whatnot. It's all part of marketing, right? So like
oh, yeah.
what's on the back of like toys, like a little description that tells you more about each character.
Vader,
um
Lord of the Sith.
Exactly. Like that's all it ever is. Like whenever a kid gets, really like attracted to like a specific concept or a specific character, and they're like, I want to know more about this. Like here it is on the back of the thing, or here it is in a novel that you can read when you're older, or if you want to read right now, that's all it ever is. It's all part of the marketing machine. So
Oh
yeah.
yeah. Funny enough, that
Yeah.
reminds me we were talking about the other franchises. Transformers actually tried this
Oh yeah.
once with
Hmm.
with their own multimedia project. Everything contradicted each other. It wasn't, and they never
Right.
talked to each other. But it tried to be one single universe with Prime in the games and some
Oh, with
comics.
Prime? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Prime
mean,
is
I
part.
used to collect the Armada show Transformers, so I know they had like little mini comics that would come with them, and I collected them, and I'm like, oh, I want to figure out this story. So that's another example of stuff like that working. So
Yeah, Prime was part of a big multimedia push that didn't really coordinate that much, sadly. But I mean, yeah, you still got the game and the show out of it, so it
right,
was
right,
fun.
right. Yeah,
So that there's that. Another big pro is you can retroactively, I think, give weight to things that may not have been weighty before,
right.
but they can now. And so, like, the biggest example to me, weirdly, is the Saw Gerrera Onderon arc from Clone Wars Season 5.
Oh yeah.
So,
Oh yeah.
taken in a vacuum, but pre the reboot, that arc's just fine. It's like, oh, look, it's Ahsoka and Anakin. They're
Right.
trading rebels. And
Right.
there's this weird guy, Saw, who's kind of a joink.
Right.
Now that arc, in the context of the day, had a lot of weight to it because, like, Saw Gerrera is this big thing. We have his entire life story almost now, from
Right.
the Onderon rebel to kind of from founding leader of the rebellion to his death, and sort of like I can
Right.
now watch that arc, which is still just fine. It's sort of like the Saw Gerrera origin story, and now kind of tracks his life from that moment till his actual death in Rogue One, and it's
Right.
great.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, no, for sure. You're absolutely, yeah, that's a really cool aspect to it. Um like but I also remember that Saw Gerrera was a character that I think even George had a lot of plans for.
that
Um
too.
with the Underworld TV show that he wanted to make. Um, and so a part of me thinks like, oh, was it as early as those Onderon episodes that George was already thinking like, hey, I want you to put in this character. His name's Saw Gerrera. He's part of this resistance, and he's going to be a major figure in my TV show. So I need you guys to, include him in this story. Um, like I don't know if that happened, but either way, like from a fan's perspective, from the viewer perspective, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we could think about Hu Yang, right? I mean,
Oh yeah.
he was just a character that was cool and was there in the Ahsoka and the Younglings arc, and then all of a sudden he's a main character or a side character, but still like he's pretty prominently there in the Ahsoka series. So
There's a
I
lot of
love
stuff with Clone
I
Wars that
love
gets.
it.
Oh no,
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff with Clone Wars weirdly that's got a lot of weight to it nowadays because sort of like everything
Oh
almost
yeah.
expands upon it. We got the Mandos, got Maul, that's
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Hmm.
Even the baby arc from
Yeah.
the Holocrons, they're like, oh, there's some Palpatine kidnapping kids early back then. I don't think
Yeah.
they never tied those things together, but you can see it.
Yeah. With the First Order.
Yeah, so there's like
Yeah.
you get a lot of weight, and obviously we're talking about Palpatine, so like they've
Right.
retroactively again put a lot more weight behind Palpatine's return by kind of like saying, oh no, he's been plotting this for a long time, and you can kind of
Yeah.
like also get the Sith
The
rituals.
Aftermath novels are interesting because there's
Oh
a
yeah,
lot of things there that you could feel were trying to be tied into, and then sometimes they just weren't. Like Captain Phasma being a little child at the end of like the third book, and it's like, oh, it's actually not Phasma. Phasma has a completely different origin story that we're gonna tell through this novel.
which I really like. I mean, I love that Phasma
No,
novel.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Like it's cool that it ended up, but like there were just a lot of attempts being made, and stuff like that just makes me think like, oh, how many through lines have maybe been proposed and got as far as to be in books that were just never followed up on because, well, things change and media changes and directions of things change. So
So
yeah,
here's a great example of that where
yeah,
it's so ambiguous
hmm,
in Aftermath, but it was so ambiguous
right,
that the answer can really be anything.
right.
So I don't know how much you remember the Aftermath trilogy.
In a
Uh,
bit, but I remember some like key points. Yeah.
there was a moment in the book near the end of Empire Then where Rex is talking about how Palpatine heard
Hmm.
this call in the unknown regions.
Right. I
That was
always
some
thought it was Snoke. I
Yeah,
always thought it was Snoke. Yeah, yeah,
everyone
yeah.
thought it was Snoke, but obviously that didn't work out.
Obviously.
Uh,
Yeah.
then people thought it was Exegol for a little bit,
Okay.
but that doesn't work anymore because
Oh,
Palpatine has Exegol all set up by at least the time of Empire Strikes
yep.
Back,
Yeah,
if
correct.
not earlier.
Yeah.
So now, and I was seeing people talk about this on the forum. Um, Obviously, this has not been confirmed. This is just people guessing. They
Yeah.
say
It's just it's
it's
theory
theorizing
crafting.
that what if they could retroactively now make that call the same Balin's hearing on Peridia? Because he's hearing a call to something
Mm.
that everyone's kind of freaking out
Yeah, yeah,
about.
yeah. That's
Uh,
an interesting concept. See, I like that way better already. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tying that into Peridia is that grade A theory. I say I like that a lot, and it's very possible it might just end up being that like retroactively because creating stories are messy in a franchise like this where there's so many creators and everything. It's bound to be messy in this way. There's never going to be a consistent through line that will always be 100% paid out. Um, so
I
yeah,
also
no, I
think
like that. I
that
like that a lot.
I also think Aftermath was probably intentionally made to be vague. So it's sort of like
Mm.
put a bunch of stuff here, and if we go this direction, fine. But if not, like we can come back with
Right,
it. Like I don't think my guess is there was never an answer. There was never an
right.
answer. It was like they were like maybe
Yeah,
it's Snoke, maybe it's not, but just kind of leave it vague enough in case we need to change our minds. I remember when we
right.
all saw Rax with Snoke for a hot second in this
Oh
one.
yeah, I definitely thought so. I was definitely thinking that. But yeah, like I even think back to the sequel trilogy. I mean, if you talk about the films themselves, in a lot of ways they leave a lot open for the next filmmaker to kind of go in and expand on things and like change things if need be, or change a direction if need be. Not exactly change things, but
Oh, yeah, no, you're
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. So like there's aspects of that, and especially becomes noticeable in like novelizations of the sequel trilogy. I think I'm thinking of the Force Awakens novelization, where like it sounds like Rey is hearing like a voice, which
Oh
hey,
yeah.
that could be Snoke or that could be Palpatine, depending on like
The
when you
Last
end up
Jedi
reading it.
novel says Snoke was hundreds of years old. He
Right,
remembers those days.
right, exactly.
Sure.
Maybe,
Sure.
maybe I still think like here's a tangent, but I still think like Snoke should have been like a Sith project in the making for hundreds of years, and Palpatine just picked it up and was like, I'm gonna make it better, and then he actually made it better, and like that was the thing.
My new Snoke theory is Snoke is
Uh,
like the mashed DNA of Palpatine and Plagueis and maybe Luke's hand.
and Luke's hand, and maybe a dash of Grogu and a little bit of Omega, just
Sure, probably.
sure, why not? Yeah, no, no, no. Who cares what Snoke is? But I think it would be interesting if
I
he did have a bit of a history that existed beforehand, even before Palpatine. But like he just kind of inherited Snoke or something.
right.
Um,
I mean, who knows? I hope one day we'll find out about the Sith Eternal and where they come from. But yeah,
yeah,
that there is a lot of that vagueness to be left open, and also, sometimes hey, we got Cobb Vanth in the Mandalorian. That's still
yeah,
the best thing ever.
very true.
I
Yeah,
love
that
that.
was great. Yeah, I was okay. I actually want to talk a little bit about this
Oh yeah.
because I was one of the people that was like, "Oh, you can never put Ahsoka in a live action anything." Like I was like, "You can't do it. Can't do it." People will be confused. People are like, "Who's that? Who like what who is that random Jedi?" Like and the boomers who are watching will be like, "What in the world? I don't want to watch a, you know, several season long, animated show in order to catch up and figure out what's going on." I very much was that mentality, and I have been continuously proven wrong. So whenever like that ended up happening, like whenever Cobb Vanth ended up showing up, I was like, wow, they're really gonna do this. They can really like that is a very individual thing where like that he could be like there's no like
There's a difference between
prerequisite
like a
to knowing
storyline and
of
a
that.
character, I think,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, that's you just hit the nail on the head. Yeah, exactly. So I was super surprised when we got Ahsoka and the kind of merging of the two canons. Like, I'm not saying that there's two canons, but paper and on screen. So it's interesting.
Right.
It's very
Oh,
interesting.
right. I was gonna ask this. I think I should have asked this when we were talking about how multimedia should be used, but you brought this up. I'm curious in your thoughts in terms of characters going in between media to continue
Yeah.
their stories. Probably
Uh,
should have brought this up as well.
right.
And I am curious to your own thoughts of if should a character story begins where it ends, or because of that unofficial hierarchy,
Hmm.
you almost are getting a promotion. Like,
Right. Right.
not again to kind of. I feel like Ahsoka's never gonna die, so let's not beat around the bush. But because the Rebels characters have now become live action characters,
Right.
if their story, if anyone were to die,
Right.
which I don't think is gonna happen, but if it happens,
Right.
you know, is it sad that it's not happening in their original medium animation, or is it like, well, live action is now the bigger thing? They're kind of getting their promotion, or like here's a better example. Kind of weirdly,
Hmm. Yeah.
Ventures kind of suffered from this a little bit. Although I give
Right.
that a little bit of leeway because it was still the early days. I think people were kind of
Yeah.
like, we don't know what's going to happen with like these continuing plot threads, so we're still
Right.
kind
Right.
of like, okay, well, Dark Disciples because Clone Wars is over and we're never going to get it back, and we got it back.
Mhm.
So it's like he dies in the book,
Right.
and now he's back clearly because I think that maybe they're like, she's a screen character. She needs to, if she is to truly die permanently, which I don't think she's going to now, it should be
Right.
on screen. But what are your thoughts on sort of like that, right? What are your thoughts?
Uh, Maybe a little anticlimactic, but I really don't mind where a character's story begins or ends. Yeah, I see a lot of people's opinions in that, like, oh, um, the story of the rebels characters should continue and conclude in animation where it belongs, But the truth is, when they cross the threshold to be live action, I really do think now their future stories are going to be live action. Like it's a permanent promotion, essentially. Like I do think now those characters belong within the Mandoverse, and that's where their stories will conclude, or at least their main stories will conclude. I'm sure we can still see these characters again in all other medias, Um, but now they are a part of a grander story that needs to conclude, and it needs to conclude in the medium that story was introduced in.
Right.
So yeah,
I've talked about this before, and I think why someone like Saw Gerrera works for me in jumping between mediums
right,
while still seeing a bit of his life is every Saw Gerrera appearance, he's not the main character. It's somebody else. It's either Jin or Ezra
right,
or Cassian. Um, so it's not his
yeah,
story, but you're kind of getting a little. But we all know him, so we're kind of getting a
right,
glimpse of this one guy
hmm
compared to Ahsoka, who is Ahsoka's story called Ahsoka. Um,
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
she's kind of a co-host star of Rebels. I don't know what was I going to say. Ooh, I almost. Oh, okay. I'm going to tease you for a second because, like you said, you didn't care.
Okay.
You would have cared if Kira had died in the Crimson comics. You know it.
Oh, absolutely, because that's a. I mean, let's be completely honest. That's a demotion.
Yeah.
Uh, like, yeah, no, it was. I absolutely would have cared. I did not want. I even made tweets about it. I did not want her to die in the comics or anything. Like, I really was crossing my fingers, crossing everything, so that it ended with her still surviving. And heck, I still feel that a little bit with this upcoming game, Outlaws. I'm like, okay,
Well,
they
this is
better not.
before that, so
Okay, so see, already I'm reassured. So,
that's
but
that. Yeah, all this is before the Kira stuff.
yeah, if you were to ask me, I want that narrative at the very least concluded in like the Lando show, which I've heard some things about that now. I don't know what's going on with it, but uh,
Uh,
yeah.
oh, that's because the guy who was originally show running it was talking about how it's no longer a show. It's like it's been a movie for we knew it's going to be a movie for a while now.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah, yeah. So why was it news again? I guess
because people
because
don't like to put headlines of Star Wars
okay,
stuff being canceled. Um,
that's okay. I should have figured that. Yeah. Okay.
um, but yeah, well, one
Yeah,
thing
I would have cared. I would have cared for sure there in that situation. Yes.
so like yeah, so it's like I guess maybe the question I think what we're discovering is if it feels like a promotion, then I think we're more okay with it. Even though again,
Right.
in a perfect world, we should all be treating this as equal, but we all know deep down it's
But
actually
we
not.
all know it doesn't. Yeah,
But
yeah. Because look, if Ventress was then to appear in her own live action TV show, like let's just say they announce a live action TV show and Ventress is, but I actually don't think that'd be too difficult of a of a
I'm crossing my fingers for Venture to show up in one of these Mando things.
yeah. Like I think at that point when she then starts interacting with the narrative in a major way, like at that point she's theirs. Like she is a live action character then, because then brand new audience will be introduced to her. They'll probably think she's sick because she's sick as fuck. But
Mhm.
um, and then we're gonna get the continuation of whatever her story is now in live action. I'm not
I
saying that's gonna happen. I'm just saying that if that were to happen, she does automatically, I think, in my opinion, becomes a live action character.
I feel that way about Cobb Vance as well, and I feel like they're still holding on to him. That book of Boba Fett
Yeah,
end credit scene. They don't want to kill him
they
off
are.
just yet.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
I do feel that way about Cobb Vance, where it's like he's a live action character now. If
He's a
he's
live
gonna
action character.
truly end, it gotta be Timothy.
Yeah.
Timothy Olyphant. I would want that.
Tell me all of it. That's not to say you can't have a tie-in book with him. I think that's definitely
Oh,
possible. But if he were to die,
right.
I don't I
It,
don't think
it
they're thinking about his death anytime soon. But
it would
if he were to die, it would be live action. Yeah.
it would be this. Like it's sort of like it'd be the thing of like we don't get a Ray film, but here's a Ray Kyan comic, and then the end he dies. That doesn't
Yeah.
seem right to me.
Yeah. 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 No. Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, but that just doesn't seem right to me in general. So,
Yeah.
but trying to go back to the pros and cons.
Oh yeah.
Here's a con that I've always thought about, and this is where I'm going to do something a little controversial. I'm
Okay.
going to somewhat defend the people who don't like Luke Skywalker in the Last Jedi. Dun,
No. Okay.
no. Okay. Not the racist or the bigot, but
Yeah, it's for sure.
I love the fact that Star Wars is one canon. Don't get me wrong, and I would not want to change it for the world.
Right.
But I do think that this is where I think something like DC has a big advantage over, and maybe because DC is just a different thing.
Right.
But in DC, you can have your own personal favorite version of a character, and it not and if you're smart, because I know some
Right.
people who get a little angsty about this, but if you're smart
Yeah.
like me, or like us, you won't get then that bent out of shape if like I'll give you the great example.
Yeah.
I don't like the Snyderverse. I don't like the Batman vs Superman, Man of Steel. Did not like it. Thank God it's gone. James Gunn saved the world.
Yeah. For sure.
But that being said, I was as shame it was to not have a big movie of Superman. You had Lois and Clark. You had a good version of Superman on TV. Different version, different universe. I got My Adventures with Superman, which is my favorite version of Superman right now. I think I finally found a version that I really love.
That you really love. Yeah.
Or look at Batman. We've had dozens of Batman. There's a new Batman out right now.
Maybe too much Batman. But
maybe too much Batman. But yeah, it's like if you don't like Burton Schumacher, you got Nolan. You got the DCAU Batman. You got Arkham Batman, even though the same voice actor, but technically different versions. We have different versions of a character, so it's like I can kind of live then in that pocket of DC or just individual character. And you kind of have that with Marvel if you like the comic but don't like the MCU. Although MCU kind of really dominates, so you don't really have it that much with Marvel. But you have Spider-Man. Like you got Spider-Man Fallen movies, you got the games, you got comics. There's no cartoon, sadly. There should be. But you got different versions. With Luke, this kind of goes into my other con, but we'll get there in a second. You really only have that one version. Now you can read Legends, and depending on if you like Legends overall, that's fine. You still run into the same situation though, of eventually you still get the not good stuff that you might not like, and then you got to get stuck with it. But you can at least enjoy kind of two versions of Luke. But look, and I but I kind of understand people who aren't maybe not full on hashtag not my Luke, but if you were really looking forward to seeing Luke having a successful Jedi Academy, kind of like we did in Legends for a time, although that went downhill. But that's another story. And even if the sacrifice stuff, it's I get it. It's kind of a bummer, and I even know people who look. We both want that Jedi Academy story. Don't get me wrong. But I know people who still don't want it because to them that's just too much of a sting. Now, could it win them over that sting? Maybe, but a lot of it sort of depends on how fundamentally do you agree with the choices that were already made, and just maybe need a little bit more clarification, a little bit more recontextualization, maybe just something to make it work for you. But if you're someone who no, I wanted Luke's Academy to be strong and shining light, you're stuck with it, and there are no other versions of Luke Skywalker. There's different parts of his history, but sort of if that kind of taints the water for you a little bit, how easy it is to go back to Luke in his glory days and kind of just enjoy his rebel time, and you kind of know, oh, well, it's going to go downhill eventually. Compared to DC or Marvel or even Transformers, where it's look how many versions of Optimus Prime there are. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, especially someone who does like that transmedia single universe thing of that particular point of view.
Right. I think they should write fan fiction. And as in I mean, I'm joking, but also here's the thing. I think what really is the problem there is they don't like, this idea of Luke Skywalker existing as a canon story. Oh no, it's canon that Luke Skywalker sucks because XYZ, even though they see it as that way. When canon itself is something that I see it more as a suggestion, if I'm being very truthful, I'm someone who enjoys canon material. But what I'm really doing is saying like, okay, I'm gonna let you guys dictate what is canon and what isn't canon. Head canon above all else is basically what I'm saying. Uh, Head canon is essentially how art works, because like what you experience out of art or a story becomes yours with whatever like messaging and themes you get out of it. So every story essentially becomes yours after listening to it. And I'm going to get very like super into the weeds of like art and story, but it's the concept of like, oh, okay, legends no longer counts. Well, it can if you want it to. You can pick up a story that is legends, that is a Luke Skywalker story, and if you want, you can headcanon it to fit in, you know uh into the current canon. It might mean you have to change a lot. It might mean you even have to disregard some stuff. But if you're already going in with that mentality, like, this is all just fiction at the end of the day, uh, do what it is you want to do and then create your own timeline. Like, that's cool. That's a cool transformative way that fans can really interact with it, um, along with fan fiction, like legitimately. Um, and I know that might seem like, oh, well, just, do it, whatever. Um, but if we were to maybe apply it in a more practical sense, um, yeah, let's just end up like view that narrative in a way where you can end up enjoying it. Like for me, there's a lot of the Rise of Skywalker that I don't love. So I do headcanon like a lot of um connections to the previous movies that some might say were intended. I personally say, you know what, I'm just going to connect these in my head because it just feels like a stronger through line between these three movies. Um, and at the end of the day, I can do that because as a viewer of art and stories, like I like this narrative becomes mine anyway at the end of the day. Um, so yeah, I mean, like that's my spiel on it. That's where I always kind of end up going with it. Like, just make it make sense. Literally, you make it make sense in your head, because at the end of the day, this is all just fiction being decided what is or not canon by a major corporation. That really what we're doing is we're allowing them to decide what is official canon or whatnot.
See, this the real question. The real answer then is we just gotta get Star Wars in the public domain, and someone can make an animated Luke Skywalker story where they marry Mara
Exactly.
Jade and they have a granddaughter named Kira.
All
I
art
don't know.
should be in public domain. Yes, you get it.
It'll never happen,
Yes. It's
but
never gonna happen. Absolutely not. Not with capitalism. But yeah, no, like this is kind of how I have thought of narratives for a while now. Like it all just doesn't matter. Like I mean, Lego Star Wars. Lego Star Wars canon, and I do consider it its own like little canon. Like
that
I
makes
know
sense.
we talk about it like it's canon adjacent as they say,
It,
but
it has to for the. I need the holiday special because something the holiday special to be canon.
yeah, for sure.
I
But
need
there have been
that.
characters from Lego stories that have turned into canon like material, like paper canon material, like the droid from Freemaker Adventures. Um, Aspects like that. And I know like there's actually like a list of things I think that have been written down that are from the Lego Star Wars stories that have moved on to canon. So like again, like if we take the idea of canon adjacent, where like, oh, we'll see characters like Harrison Dula from canon in these Lego stories, um, then pretty much everything, if you really think about it, is canon adjacent because it's just told through a lens of the creator of that specific story. Um, I actually have a thread that I specifically wanted to read out loud here, and
For
how
sure.
Pablo Hidalgo kind of thinks about canon in general, and just also what I think about all this stuff and how to kind of like figure out how like inconsistencies exist that maybe you don't like, or maybe like itself kind of butt heads, how you can eventually just end up being fine with it once you see narratives in this kind of lens. I don't know, should I read it now or
Uh,
Or should I wait until after we're done with the pros and cons? Because
let's get that's the pros and cons.
after the pros and cons, I went on my tangent.
No, go ahead.
That's a little sneak peek for what we can do after this. So
Yeah. You know, I mean, I've always sort of said this, and you know, I think I said it once on the show. Every author in some way in Star Wars has their own little mini canon.
exactly.
And what is it? Just they're just interpreting their own head canon, right? So like,
Yeah.
you know, it's like if one day an author wants to do their own thing, exploring the dyad, they can, and who knows, Omar might completely contradict anything.
I might hate it. I really hope I don't hate it, but like that's
or
just
it might
as a Star Wars fan,
or it might contradict it, but it's like, oh, this is way better.
Yeah, that
I always
also happen.
I always like to think I mean, that's my mentality of like, if you're writing it, you're probably smarter than me. I never like to think I'm smarter than the creatives who make
than the writers or the creatives who like studied it and have done it a billion times. So yeah,
I ain't that smart. You know, or you know, kind of their own view of the Star Wars universe. Like, ever read a Tim Zahn novel? That dude's got his own particular versions of how Star Wars works.
Right.
Both in the canon stuff and in his legend stuff. Like the way the Force works in his stuff is not very mystical. It does feel more like metaphysical telekinesis almost.
Yeah. No, I definitely have always kind of gotten that vibe. I've only read Heir to the Empire and Thrawn, the novel in canon. So, but even from those, I'm just kind of like
compared to sneak peek for next week, maybe. Tom Veich's Tales of the Jedi / Dark Empire stuff, where that dude writes the Force very much like ontological good and evil, the cosmic.
Yeah.
It's the true battle of the devil and the angels and the good and evil, like very light, dark, heavy.
For sure, this concept goes great with the thread I'm going to read at the end. So,
or you know, even backstories, right? Like, I don't know if you've ever read the Phantom Menace novelization or seen the excerpt that I like to show people of.
I did read the Phantom Menace novel, but I don't know what you're talking about.
There is a part in the novel that goes into the history of the Sith. I'm going to assume it's based off of George Lucas's own notes.
Has to be,
because that is very different to anything that Tales of the Jedi was talking about back in the day, where like it was 2,000 years ago, and apparently the Sith killed each other within like a couple of months of forming.
Right.
There was like only 50 of them until the Rule of 2 happened, compared to obviously what we got now, or even back in Legend, which is like, oh no, there's these Sith Jedi wars that happened every couple thousand years with Revenant, Vitiate, Exarchune, and all that good stuff.
And how they try to make it work somehow, right? Because like, didn't it say that like the Sith ruled the galaxy or something for a period of time? Or...
Right. I mean, in current canon, it's very vague because we don't have that time period fleshed out. But it's it's sort of a mix of more of lined into what Legends is in terms of like an outline in terms of like the details. But you know, eventually, like whoever's writing it, be it Charles Soule or a team or a movie person, like they're gonna include their own headcanons of like, this is how I thought the ancient galaxy worked as well.
Right.
And speaking of headcanons, I guess kind of goes into one of my cons, but also one of my, which is kind of a pro as well. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Is like, well, again, it's sort of like, I guess the thing with headcanon is people who do that, it's sort of the best way to cope with something you don't like.
I mean, I'm not even going to deny that. No, absolutely not. It is kind of a cope, but it's also just kind of how you experience things.
Right.
Like, I don't know.
I mean, I guess it, right. Like, again, like I kind of get it. Like, I understand if you really don't like the direction, like or even if you don't like the fact you died, period. You'd rather have lots of Rey and Luke adventures than them doing epic stuff together. Or, you know, you just wish Luke and Mara Jade were having their kids and whatnot.
Right.
Or, you know, even stuff like bringing back Palpatine. We talked about it earlier, you know. There are people who don't like that and still wish it hadn't happened.
Right.
I mean, I guess at some point, you know, you just kind of have to move on and kind of like enjoy the stuff. I mean, it is always interesting kind of seeing people not. I mean, I kind of get it. Like, oh, it's building upon the thing I don't like, even if it's better. I mean, I've always said this, Omar. And this is kind of an interesting thing. I
Uh-huh.
think there are two types of prequel haters. I mean, not haters.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, yeah, haters. In some extent, it's to some extent, but not really.
Okay.
Moderate haters. Well, not even moderate haters. People who just kind of like, oh, I think I call them the rational people. The people are like, oh, prequels, good ideas, but oh, the acting's wooden. I don't think that CGI
That's me.
or I like why is it a little overly convoluted or like this could be streamlined, whatever. Like
Yeah.
and then there are people just wow, I just like the prequels. It's like no, I do not like the way the Jedi Order are. I don't want them to be space cops.
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
and to this day, no matter how well written, being like things that I do think are better, maybe writtenly than the prequels, like the Acolyte or even the Plagueis novel,
Mhm.
or Clone Wars or a certain arcs of Clone Wars, like no, still can't get behind this. Still just can't. I fundamentally do not like the creative choices George Lucas made. It's not
Right.
even like on an execution level. It's the conceptual level. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that's sort of like the blockage here. Like they can't get behind it on a conceptual level,
Right.
right? Like, and to me, that's a big difference between just execution. It's like, yeah, no, that line was weirdly delivered. Like, no, on a conceptual level,
As a
I
conceptual
don't.
level, they don't like what Star Wars has become because of
Right.
George's expansion of the ideas. And
Or even the or Last Jedi or Rise of Skywalker itself.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And on some regard, I respect it that they're able to identify, oh, I don't like what Star Wars has become. I don't it's clearly not for me. But, very clearly some of them really want to remind everybody how much they hate it now. But all the respect to people that recognize, like, oh, George went a direction that I just didn't see. I wasn't interested in. So then I stopped. I just stopped. I stopped experiencing Star Wars after that. And it's like, that's good. But yeah. So
No,
yeah,
and,
yeah, yeah. So like, it's okay to like not like the direction of something that it goes. So yeah.
oh yeah, a lot of it's kind of like
Mhm.
you can't headcan it, or you can try to view it a certain way. Like I've seen people go on about how they still don't like the chosen one thing,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
Anakin's the chosen one, and it sort of like kind of takes away the meaning of choice by adding all this prophecy stuff.
Mhm.
Now, I mean, now me, I like the chosen one thing, but I like it for like a very different reason.
Right.
Um, because even if like I like it because I kind of feel like I think it's. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think it's George Lucas almost making fun of it,
Mhm.
where you know. I'll use Avatar. Like, Avatar Last Airbender. Aang is the chosen one. He
Right.
is the Avatar, right? And
Mhm.
George Lucas like, okay, like, it's like, yeah, Anakin's like the Avatar. He's gonna be the chosen one.
Right.
Oh yeah, but also, yeah, because of that, he could get a big ego and become the fascist villain for 20 years. That'd be like if
Right.
Aang became the Fire Lord and tried to take over the world. I
Yeah.
feel like he's almost like instead of a straight, and then the chosen one defeats the Dark Lord. The
Mhm.
chosen one joins the Dark Lord and become pure evil for like 20 years. I
Yeah.
like that. I like that sort of inverse of the chosen one trope
Mhm.
that the prequels might be doing. I don't know. I think it is.
Yeah.
So that's my way of liking it. And also, I just don't think it really does take away anything from Return of the Jedi. 'Cause at the end of the day, it's not like Vader's chucking down the Emperor because of like I must fulfill the prophecy.
Yeah,
Like get away
exactly.
from my son. I love
Right.
him. I'm gonna be a good dad for one still. And it's like the chosen one stuff's almost like
Mhm.
you could argue unnecessary, but it's like just a little cherry on top. So that's sort of my example there. Kind of that's my headcanon
No,
slash
I agree with it.
rationalization.
I agree. I mean, yeah, it's so funny that we're talking about like, um, elements to stories that have been added and retroactively change things. When George Lucas is probably the biggest example of someone who does that, right?
But he
Like
doesn't care.
he
Canon's
does
for
not
words.
care. Yeah, 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 exactly. He does not care. He'll change the entire concept of something that existed, and he'll
Anakin
be
had
like,
an
oh,
apprentice. What
that's
now?
what it is now. Like that is just what it is now.
Mhm.
And in some regards, like I think it's pretty awesome that he does that. Like to be able to change what a story is, and like just look the audience in the eye, and it's like that's what it is now. That's it. And it's like, wow, okay, yeah,
Bollocks.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool, honestly. Like just
Yeah.
admiring it from like a creative kind of point of view, but I know a lot of people don't love it from a creative point of view. So
Oh yeah. I
yeah.
mean, the funny thing about Clone Wars to me, the series, I mean, I'm sure Dave loved the prequels. Like, I don't think he's a prequel hater, but I do kind of feel
Yeah.
like even he's in some ways making the prequels that he probably already likes work more for him. And
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know what's
Exactly.
funny? You know what's funny? People always say like how modern Star Wars hates the lore and hates the canon. I
Yeah.
actually think modern Star Wars creators on all fronts really have probably adhered more to canon and lore and been a lot more thoughtful of what they do, even more like there's been no one who's like, all right, here's Han Solo as a kid on Kashyyyk. Like no one's done that.
Yeah.
Like I think,
Yeah.
Leslie Headland's done it, Dave's doing it, even Tony Gilroy still does it. Um
Yeah.
like there has been no I mean maybe the closest thing is bringing back Palpatine, but that's not the
Maybe.
biggest thing ever. Like
I
okay.
really don't think George would have cared if they
I know
brought back Palpatine, in
oh
my opinion.
he's not above doing that. But I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
in terms of like completely just retroactively changing Star Wars the same way George did. I don't think anyone's ever truly done that. Not
Yeah.
to my knowledge. I
Yeah,
feel
no
like
doubt. In fact, I would even say that a lot of the things that say, "Oh, current canon goes against what George built and created," I would say I think current canon really researches and pays attention to what George has said in the past in order to kind of bend over backwards to adhere to what he has said. Um, like, I mean, granted, there's still a lot of vagueness that exists, so that there's wiggle room for creatives, but yeah, I don't know. Like maybe it comes with the privilege of being able to already have all the completed works of George Lucas on hand. Because at the time, the prequels were being made along with all this other extended material, so they really had to be careful with what feet they stepped on when telling a story. Um, but I just feel like Canon has been doing a really good job of like looking at what George built and says, okay, we're just gonna work with you, George. And George isn't even around to be able to say, okay. But
I
like they just I think they really think about it. And I mean,
agree.
it's proof enough with Dave Filoni, and like he cares a lot about what George does. Even though, yes, I think I'm really glad you said it, that Dave Filoni is telling his own version of what he kind of the lessons he has gotten from George. And I think he always has, like
Oh
even
yeah.
from the earliest days. And I think George let him. And so I feel like that already kind of shows you like George doesn't care. Like, hey, work in my penthouse. It's totally fine. I
Oh,
might
I
not.
mean, look at the Mandoverse. I mean,
Yeah.
this is Dave telling the Thrawn trilogy, which I
Yeah.
think very much influenced him. Like, I think he is. I mean, if given his age, I think he is a kid that very much, in his mind, this is not probably him being anti-sequel trilogies. It's probably him like, yeah, for me, growing up, Thrawn trilogy was the sequels for us.
Yeah.
That's why he's doing this particular story. Or, look at Leslie Headland, him, Dave, Pablo. When they brought in Papa Plagueis, I call him Papa Plagueis.
Right.
Papa Plagueis.
Papa
That's
Plagueis.
why he is a spindly looking mune instead of just a random
Yeah.
dude.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
they're
Yeah,
com-
no, I love it. I love what they're doing because I do think they're paying respects to a lot of what has come before, while also giving a lot of creative freedom to creatives. But of course, like to tie it back into the main topic here, it's all just depends on um, what they plan on doing with whatever story they have and what medium and what like direction they want to go. So yeah,
So here's sort of, I guess, maybe the last kind of last question
okay,
I can kind of think of, unless I think of other things when we talk.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I have a thread still I have to read, but
right,
yes,
right. Maybe that will spur more conversation too.
yeah, yeah.
Does this ever become un I don't know unattainable is the right like untenable at a certain point? Because that's sort of I think Legends even struggled with because it just kept going.
Yeah.
Some of that was just George eventually like here's like and some of it's just George himself being like I know we got like a bunch of comics and stuff that tell the story of the Clone Wars, but I'm gonna do my own Clone Wars show, and I don't give a shit about the comics.
Right,
I'm gonna
right.
do my own Quinlan boss arc with Dark Disciple. That we already did in the comics. Um, Although he did try to get Australia to write Clone Wars, that was nice. The
Right,
exact
right.
income, but so does this? Yes, the answer can still be keep moving forward and back, and I'm sure they'll still do that. But I guess the worry is always going to be making it too unpenetrable. Which I think if you keep making just standalone films instead of like ongoing series focusing on a small set of characters, that's probably avoidable. But you know, in 30 years, 40 years, someone's gonna want to come and say like, "Hey, I got a great idea for a Luke Skywalker story set in between
Right.
episodes 4 and 5. I
Right.
really want to tell it." Are we just gonna say no to him, especially if it's like the greatest idea ever? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
the comics be damned at that point. I don't know, but like,
It's a
I don't
question of
know.
reboots.
Question of
There's
reboots. I mean, that's the
yeah.
scariest thing. It's like
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
you did it. You got away with it once because we could,
Yeah.
because it was mostly books and comics. Sorry, books and comic lovers. No. But
Right.
let's face it, that was a lot easier to do back then.
Hmm.
Um, if this canon just keeps going and going and going,
Hmm.
does it become unsustainable after a certain point? There are ways to move forward and back, but I mean, and by back I mean before Phantom Menace. But people are gonna want to do in between stuff. People might look at like, hey, Jedi of the Old Republic canon version. I
Right.
really like this person. I got a great idea for them now. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think this can one day become unsustainable? Obviously, maybe not in the next decade, but in 20 years, 30
I
years,
mean,
40 years, if
I
we're
mean,
all alive.
yeah, yeah,
If,
yeah. I mean, if you ask me, it like also actually no. If you ask a bunch of people, they're gonna tell you that the canon has already not been sustained very much because of several inconsistencies and several things that have retconned, as they say. Um, I remember one Twitter user who's mutual who used to do this, um, or they used to do this. They basically made a whole account chronicling the inconsistencies that existed in the new canon, and this was back before the Rise of Skywalker. So
I would
this was
like, I'd be
this
curious to see
was
what they were talking about because I'm kind
they
of
had a
curious.
whole Twitter full of it, like of early canon stuff from like the first era of the new canon, and they changed it. They changed it. Now they are Queers Watch, which is a completely different concept, where they look for queer content within Star Wars. Very good account, highly recommend. They're great. I've known them for years, and but they used to do instead of that, they used to do inconsistencies within canon, and
Be
it was
curious to see what the examples were.
yeah, I know, right? Because like even from the earliest of days, from like literally the first 2 years, there was inconsistencies that exist. They were minor, they were very tiny, but like they existed. And
I
it's I always thought like it was interesting that they stopped around like before the sequel trilogy truly ended, um, because like I'm sure since then there's been even more that just haven't been caught. You
I
know?
guess
Hmm.
I guess my thing is, and maybe that's just me not being as nitpicky. To
Yeah,
me,
yeah,
like little inconsistencies are fine. Like oh, someone has a this
right.
blaster, that, but I don't care about that.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
a.
yeah.
I'm talking about
The big stuff.
the big stuff like back in the day when Clone Wars came out, where
Yeah.
it's like even Peel or somebody was supposed to be dead, and
Right.
then it's like, oh no, they're alive. Or
Right, right, right.
Quinlan Voss's characterization just being a complete 180 of something that was already kind of established in the comics.
Right,
I
right.
remember that big controversy. There was a lot of Clone Wars big, like there were like big. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
this I mean, the biggest kind of one is the prequels themselves
Mhm.
not adhering to anything the
Not adhering to
novels,
anything.
the
Yeah.
clones were the villains. Like,
Right.
to me, that is like I'd be curious if one day we ever get back to like those bigger things. Like again, 'cause to me, the like little inconsistencies, like
Yeah.
that doesn't matter that much. Like
I get
like
you.
I
I
don't
get you.
care. I don't care if
Yeah.
Oath is not holding the crystal in her hand when she's bleeding the
Right.
lightsaber. You know,
Right.
it's still lightsaber's bleeding. That's still very much, as far as
Mhm.
I'm concerned,
Yeah.
that's
But the
close
account
enough.
also covered like just different depictions of like Catalyst versus like this one comic book one off that like I think, like in terms of like a canon depiction of an event that just happened differently. I mean, heck,
Bad
Kanan,
Batch.
yeah, Bad Batch and Kanan, like
That's a
stuff
good
like that.
Ahsoka.
So like I guess to kind of bring in the point of that, like they like regardless of whether it's small inconsistencies or the big stuff, I think depending on who you ask, they'll say, "Oh, canon already doesn't matter," or they'll say, "Oh, it already kind of just doesn't like who cares anyway because we don't really care too much about like the small stuff." So like I think if we were ever to get to a point where someone says, "I want to make a movie that's set in between this and we're going to throw out, um the comic books and whatnot," I think
Mhm.
they'll just do that. In my opinion, the biggest thing that is holding back maybe some potential for future storytelling is the idea of there being a one canon. So yeah, I don't know. That's my
That
answer. Like I truly do think like if there is a possibility of like a big tier filmmaker that's like, I want to tell this Luke Skywalker story, but it just so happens to throw out like all of the Marvel grunt, I'd be like, oh well, I mean,
Or they
let's
can do
see it.
really
Yeah.
enough what later Legends did with like got the Essential Guide to War. That's got the Clone Wars, and it tries its dangest to tie in the Clone Wars
Yeah.
show and the comics pre the Clone Wars show.
Yeah, I mean, I love
So
stuff like that. I love
yeah,
things like that that try to tie in, make sure everything works together, and that's what I think will always end up happening among fans or among, the. I feel like these franchises have a way of
the NPCU.
correcting themselves in that regard, or an attempt to correct. I know people are gonna, call bullshit on certain things, but like, I love Skywalker: A Family at War, the
Oh, that's
novelization, the novel from Kristen Baver. She does such a good job at like connecting so many stories together.
I mean, my favorite book right now is Rise and Fall of the Empire.
Yes, I have that on Kindle. I still need to finish it, but like just the first couple chapters, I'm like, this is amazing. Like this is connecting so many things and it's making sense out of things that, even like those individual stories might not perfectly align in the most perfect of perfect ways, but like here is this book that is able to put everything into a perspective of a singular perspective, and that's really, really freaking cool.
Oh, I
So
mean, here's a great example of that. Semi-spoiled, but I think you kind of already know. You know, I still will never be able to watch Return of the Jedi and think to myself, Darth
mhm.
Vader has a bunch of adventures. Like, I would like the joke of, like, when
Yeah,
Darth Vader's getting out of the shuttle on in the Death Star, he's like, "Ugh, all that
yeah,
stuff with the Dark Droids. And then when Palpatine's coming, like, "Ugh, never, all that
yeah,
stuff
yeah,
with
yeah.
Kira, Lord Vader,
Remember all
we
this?
need to win. We need
Yeah,
to
yeah,
win after
yeah,
all that stuff going
yeah.
down.
We've just
You
been
know,
catching L's, Lord Vader.
you somebody else and
Yeah,
Afra and all that stuff. But I've always said to some extent that like people who get all bent out of shape for all those adventures, it's like, is that really going to affect how you feel about it on screen? And it won't. But unless they really want to. Um,
mhm.
but Rise and Fall of the Empire, it takes into account the Crimson Dawn stuff, and even had a paragraph of like, oh yeah, and there was this like droid thing that happened, and it works. It
Yeah,
kind of synthesizes that very tight moment of in between Hoth and Endor
yeah.
of like, oh yeah, all this stuff with Crimson Dawn happened, and this is kind of how it affects the wider galactic empire.
Right,
Um,
right.
which
Also,
I
that's
think,
yeah. Go on, go on.
is also sorry. Now I thought of something else too,
Okay,
which
go
is
ahead,
also
go ahead.
something another thing I think maybe we as fans think a little too hard on is I think we want the storytelling to synthesize if that's what you like synthesize everything and I think maybe we kind of just need to view the story as the story
Yeah,
and then kind of let other things worry about how it fits later. So,
right.
like, if I don't like, I think saying I don't like all these Vader adventures
Mhm.
because there's like, how on the heck did he have all these adventures before
Right.
episode six?
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, that's your problem. Okay, but I think it's
Right.
sort of like, well, if it's still a fun story and if you're enjoying it, like maybe that should not be your first thought. It's like here's just a fun Vader story. Yeah, it said it in between episode 5 and 6, so some of that's infecting it, but then
Right.
it's still a fun story. Worry about timelines later. That's what a timeline book is for.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And Star Wars never
Exactly.
cared about timelines anyway in their
Yeah,
storytelling
yeah, yeah,
anyway.
yeah. For sure, for sure. And yeah, I agree with all that. It really the story itself should, work as a standalone story. And but I also think it's okay to say like, oh, hey, I like this story because of how it informs other stories.
Oh yeah,
I think
100%.
that's very cool as well. But like at the end of the day, like yeah, these are singular stories that have to have a beginning, middle, and end, and have to have a satisfying conclusion in some regard, um, unless they're tying in something else, But like
Or
yeah,
your
yeah, yeah,
sequel, I
or a
guess.
sequel, So yeah, no, yeah, I agree with that, and I think once I read my thread, I will
Yep.
kind of wrap up a lot of the stuff in
Well,
that
yeah.
regard. I did.
Rap.
I oh,
Oh,
okay,
that's my
go ahead.
dad. That's my
Yeah,
dad.
yeah. Oh, that's fine. Yeah,
No, go ahead. Read your thread. I think we can make this
yeah,
the
for sure.
final part.
Before I read that thread, I did want to say
Yeah.
I know the Marvel run is going to be ending soon of Star Wars
Hmm.
2020.
Yeah.
Uh, I kind of want to challenge myself to read all of it, like literally from the 2015 on, because like I started reading the 2015 stuff along with Darth Vader, and I stopped somewhere before it all ended, like all of them ended. I think I got through the Darth Vader run, and I think that's like 2015's Darth Vader run. I
I've
think
only
I
went
got
for 20 issues, so it wasn't that long.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think when that ended, I think that's when I stopped reading like all of the comics there. So like I'm kind of curious how a huge binge would go if I were to read like everything from 2015 all the way to the end that's about to wrap up and
I would
see
honestly say probably better than reading
probably
through
better just as like a sit down binge for the whole thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because
Uh-huh.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Sorry, I keep spreading.
No,
I keep
go
thinking
ahead.
other things. But what the funny thing is, people always say, "Oh, all this stuff is happening, and how can
Yeah,
you cram it in?" I did an episode of the podcast talking about time and storytelling,
right.
and like when you kind of really think about certain things
Mm,
in the context of the comics, especially,
right.
like for all we know, and I think in some ways I think it's true, a 10 or 5 issue arc of like an adventure with Vader. Yeah, it's 5 issues and it's going on for months, so it
Yeah.
feels like a lot. But when you really think about like the in-universe time, Vader's only been doing this for like I don't know, like a day or a couple hours. So like
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
5 issues of this big thing. It's like, oh no, this has only been going on for like an hour.
Yeah.
There's one arc in particular which I really like, which is actually a really good arc that like really informs stuff called the Hope Dies arc. One of my
Yeah.
favorites. I
Yeah.
think it's like 7 or 8 issues.
Right.
That battle only probably takes place over the course of a couple hours. Like
Mhm.
7 or 8 issues probably went on for like months.
Right.
Seven, but probably only takes place over the course of an hour. So I'd be curious also to see if like your view of time in Star Wars might be affected because you're binging it and kind of seeing it as like a
Right.
full story instead of like waiting months and months.
Right. Right. Yeah, yeah, I'd be curious about that too. And I think at the end of the day, like what they ended up doing, it probably is just more akin to like the classic Marvel run of Star Wars, which was just like how many issues of that? Like 100 and something, maybe
Oh, there was
200.
a
I don't know.
lot.
Like I don't know. Like there's so much. Like so yeah, I'd be curious how a quick binge would go through among, and also to see very specifically how when these stories got released, like, oh, I could tell Rogue One came out around this time because they're making little references to Rogue One. Or oh, they're making little references to oh, X-Wing's now a thing. Oh, so now right, this is post Rise of Skywalker got released, so now they're touching on that. Like it's always fun to
Oh
see
yeah.
like the real world effects and how they have to pivot within their own story. Like, oh, we want to connect to everything here, so let's
The
go ahead and do
Gillen
it
run
here.
was really interesting because of
Right.
how it connected to Rogue One and Solo.
And
So
Solo. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that was
See,
a fun one.
that stuff's cool. But okay, I want to read this thread that I
Yes.
have. I'm probably gonna be in the dark because
Oh
see,
no,
yeah, I'm
it's okay.
getting the Twitter out. All right. Let's see. I was talking about. I'm gonna read this thread that I wrote, but I'm
Okay.
also gonna talk about like some of the Pablo quotes. So
Yeah.
the medium lenses. So, in my opinion, every story or maybe medium has their own lens of the consistent galaxy. There
Mhm,
is a Rebels esque version of Andor that
mhm.
exists within the Rebels narrative, just like there is an Andor esque version of Young Jedi Adventures somewhere out there. Uh, and I'll talk about that first tweet just for a second.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's just the concept of like all of these stories. Like I almost see them as like portals into like the imaginations of these authors, and
Mhm.
in these worlds, like Andor still happened in the Young Jedi adventure, storyline. So it probably looked very different. Like just like everything in that universe looks very different, and narratively is told different, because in real life
Nubs,
it nub
subtitled, Lucy
exactly,
speech.
exactly. And it's a funny concept to think about, but it's also like yeah, of course there's an Andor version of events that happen in Rebels, right?
Mhm.
Like it has to.
Right.
So let's see. I go on to say that this isn't a view I particularly created, but it's one that I think any viewer of a transmedia franchise eventually adopts to make peace with the broadening of target audiences and individual creatives' personal and sometimes contrasting flares. Meaning, and just to go over that, just the idea of like there's so many creatives that are jump into like Star Wars and stuff. Of course, no two creatives are going to agree on how to tell a story, and so of course no two creatives are going to have a consistent like narrative flow or way that they present the story together. So that kind of goes into that.
Mhm.
um and then I go into Pablo Hidalgo's kind of breakdown that he has previously said. I saved these screenshots because he is a locked account, but I think this stuff is
I wish I
very,
had my screenshots thing. I could show it,
yeah.
but I don't know how that works.
Actually, I think he's not locked anymore. I think he's a public account again. I don't know. Well, either way, I'm gonna read it. So,
Okay, yeah.
Pablo Hidalgo says, "I'm increasingly of the belief that if there has to be one true Star Wars reality, none of us can see it, and every story is an attempt to tap into it. Basically trying to reconstruct antiquity from available pieces of like history." So that already in itself is such an interesting way, I think, to view Star Wars. Because like no, I love the idea that there is not even a single like real version of Star Wars that you can kind of count on.
Mhm.
Maybe even George Lucas's version isn't necessarily the original, like prime version of Star Wars. I mean, it probably is because that is what it is. But regardless, I like the idea of just thinking like every creative kind of has their own unique vision,
Mhm.
and we're trying to piece together antiquity from all these sources. Maybe Kristen Baver is kind of evidence of like this attempt to make everything make sense in that way. So
Chris Kempshaw now is trying.
Chris Kemshaw, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to continue on reading Pablo's tweets. It says, "I admit to a fondness for the wild early days when we accepted that Carmine Infantino Luke and Al Williamson Luke were the same character without much difficulty." I think those names might be like comic drawers or comic artists,
Okay.
where they depicted Luke as a very buff man and also a probably more accurate depiction of a scrawny Luke. And yeah, everyone didn't care. Like, I'm sure there wasn't a person that was like, "Hey," well, actually, there probably was people that nitpicked hard enough
Oh,
to be like, "Why isn't he so buff in this issue?" But yeah, so and I'm going to continue on, and he says, "I think examining any fictional universe is about more than what surfaces in the finished story. It's about knowing the drafts, the creators, and the process. I'm wary of approaches that erase such considerations." Um, yeah, I think that's great because like yeah, it's telling the audience to, hey, kind of get out of your own head for a second and realize that these are things that are made by people. These are stories that are created by individuals. They don't just spring out of thin air and are perfectly connected to everything in a perfect like kind of way. These are You have to have the mentality that like there are sometimes teams of people that are able to that are the reason why your favorite media exists. And even within those teams, it's never going to be perfectly aligned for one vision. And ultimately, you get a story that has to accommodate or several kind of visions sometimes. So okay, and here's the last tweet from Pablo, and it's kind of in regards to history and fact. So he says, "From a presentation I've given about canon, a quote from a history book." And now I'm going to read the quote. History and fact. History is something very distinct from facts. Historians ask not only what happened, but also why it happened, how it happened, and what the consequences were, and use the answers to forge the links in chains of events, creating a continuous narrative. These are the kinds of inquiries that historians make. And from their conclusions, the past, for most of us, become a much more comprehensible place. So then Pablo goes on to say that this quote specifically shaped how he views things. If he took canon to mean facts, then it's different than the stories itself. It's a tool to use in storytelling, just the same way as facts works into historical fiction. So yeah, it's this cool idea, I think,
Yeah,
that exists in
I got a
regards
lot to
to
respond to that because
yeah,
I
for
think
sure.
he,
Okay, so that's pretty much my thread. So go
oh
go
yeah,
right ahead. Yeah.
I think he's 100% right. So like,
Uh-huh.
I think a lot about the through the portal view thing,
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
I have kind of like two kind of big thoughts on that.
Mhm,
That affects the way we can see sort of the thematics.
mhm.
And also, of course, yeah, the whole, there's an Andor version of Young Jedi
Yeah,
Adventures out there somewhere. I will say, though, I'm sure when you discuss this, you probably should kind of consider what sort of tone you want for an idea. Because I do
yeah,
think certain,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think Young Jedi Adventures work because it's a piece of time. And,
Right.
you can't tell that more cutesy story, of just, oh, look, Jedi, and they're fighting like a little cute kid pirates. I don't think that works in the dark time. It's like, oh no,
Right.
Darth Vader's not sharing.
Yeah.
He's stealing fruit.
He's stealing fruit. Yeah, yeah,
No good fascist dictatorship.
yeah. Right.
Um, so there's that. But back to the thematics, 'cause I think this is where things get like really interesting. Um, there's always a lot of talk about, is Anakin redeemed? Was he not? Blah 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 blah. This
Right.
is sort of like my interpretation of it. In the context of the original trilogy,
Uh-huh.
and probably you had the prequels as well. The answer is yes, because the original trilogy is a very Luke-centric story, or at least, yeah, the
Right.
original trilogy is, and obviously the prequels are an Anakin-centric story. So, as far as Luke's concerned, yeah, he had that magical moment with his dad and gets to be a Force ghost.
Right.
Ahsoka's from Ahsoka's point of view, so that's more complicated because she's
It
got more
is.
complicated feelings about Anakin and all of that stuff going on. If
Right.
you tell a Leia story, you have like
It's
Bloodline,
gonna be
or
complicated
it's
again.
complicated to probably no. The answer is no. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
already, and and even though those books and um and shows are maybe like more totally aligned to one another. It's not the extreme of like Andor and Young Jedi Adventures, clearly.
Right, right, right.
But just in terms of the thematics, no, not really. Yeah, there is more of a complicated on that
Mhm.
viewpoint. Same with the Jedi in the rich prequel trilogy. Yeah, I've
Right.
gone on about kind of do agree with like, yeah, I don't think the Jedi are mentally flawed. But acting
Right.
like they're certainly meant to be flawed because that's the point of that story. That is the lens in which
Right.
the story is being told.
Exactly.
And High Republic, no, we get the High Republic says like this is the Jedi at their best. So obviously there's a lot more escapism going on. So yeah, I think very much of especially when the authors do have, and I include video bring people to very distinct tones.
Yeah.
uh, there will be kind of that difference. I don't know. Again, on the one hand, like I do kind of get the critique of, oh, maybe this is kind of being limited by the tone. Like I could definitely, like I kind of understand like some of the early Rebel stuff of like cartoonily
Cartoonish kind
fascistic
of. Yeah.
fascistic imperials. Although it got a lot darker by the time Thrawn showed up.
Right,
Um,
right.
and but like, I can tell he probably couldn't go as far because Disney XD.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
compared to like how bad Batch really went all out. Like, oh dang, this is some scary, dark, fascistic science.
Oh yeah.
Um, but I completely understand. I think I get it. Like, man, and I look. One thing we talk about like marketing stuff. I look at the movies that the slate of movies that hopefully will happen, and I think the time period doesn't matter so much as it's
Right.
the audience it's kind of going to reach. So Mandalorian and the Filoni film are going to reach the Mando fans and the kind of the Mando Legends holdouts.
Hmm.
I think the Ray film is going to be a little bit more young adult driven, probably like young up and coming Jedi, and they're young, still getting their feet wet, master, trying to figure this stuff out.
Right.
And the Mangled film probably will be a little more on that mature, darker side, biblical epic.
Right. Yeah.
Because I do think, I talked about this with Matthew,
Hmm.
I think certain concepts kind of deserve a little bit more execution and attention than others.
Hmm.
Like I this is sort of the example I gave him, but like I'm super excited for the Dawn of the Jedi film.
Hmm.
I'd probably be a little dampened if J.J. Abrams were directing it and writing it,
Right.
because I
Yeah.
just
I
don't
think.
think that's in his
Yeah.
wheelhouse. If you want that kind of story compared to like if J.J. Abrams did like the Han Solo story, I'm like, oh, that's perfect.
Yeah. 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 I
Very fine.
agree. I agree with that. With that idea. Yeah.
Now, granted,
Like
if Lord
depending
Miller
on.
had written and directed Solo, like, oh god, we're gonna be some freak out. Love those guys.
Right. There's some
Uh,
concepts that I think fit the creative more so than others. Like when you hear Alexander Freed is going to be doing a trilogy of,
he's
like,
only doing
say,
one book.
oh,
He's
he's only
not
doing
doing.
what? That's right. That's right. But either way, he's doing a story like specifically with that kind of premise that was just recently announced, Reign of the Empire. I mean, I wasn't the only one that went, "Oh, that's perfect," right?
I know.
Like, come on,
Oh,
come on, so good of a choice for someone to write that specific book. So yeah, I think yeah, if J.J. Abrams was tackling that, I'd be like, but no, this is James Mangold. He has covered more kind of intense narratives and narratives about well, probably more. Well, I wouldn't say more epic things, but yeah, I'm curious to see how he's going to tackle this one for sure. Like, in
he's definitely on my short list of people I trust with it. Him and
yeah,
Ryan Johnson probably the other two.
yeah,
Um,
I liked Indiana Jones.
but I like Logan, so I know
Oh
what
yeah,
he
yeah, there
can
you
do.
go. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
I know what he can do with Logan.
for sure.
And I like his, and I like that other Wolverine movie he did. I thought that was pretty good.
Origins, right?
No, not Origins. That's the bad
Oh,
one.
not Origins. That's the
Uh,
bad one. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's the
yeah.
Wolverine. It's the one in
The
Japan.
Wolverine. The Wolverine. That's right.
Um,
I forgot he did
underrated.
that one too. I forgot he did that one too.
Underrated film. Very, I think, very underrated. Yeah, he's good. He's
Yeah.
definitely a good pick for that one. But yeah, like yeah, I think yeah, I agree. Like certain that sort of every story. I always like to say this: every Star Wars book is its own little mini canon,
Yes.
right? And depending on who, like all of Tim Zahn's work is like its own little mini universe at this point,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I in my
including his
head,
legend stuff.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it almost feels like he's really taking from that and incorporating into his current canon stuff, but which I think he is. But like in my head, I see like the portals thing that I mentioned, like literally a world between world kind of situation where like each portal is uniquely designed for whatever
Yeah.
specific creative medium or whatever it gets told inside there. So um,
I'll
yeah,
I'll say this, and maybe this is and to kind of give credence to the maybe the sequel should have had like a focal point
mhm,
kind of situation. I do wonder if like we've made it work in our heads, but
yeah,
I do kind of feel like Force Awakens and Force Awakens and Last Jedi actually do really work well together. But there is a
yeah.
bit of that
Yeah.
kind of disconnect a little bit compared to like
Yeah, because you have different creatives. I mean,
whereas like even the original trilogy, you still had George kind of
mhm,
captaining the ship, even if he wasn't executing it by the time of
right.
Empire and Return of the Jedi a little bit.
Yeah, if you
Uh,
were to ask me, I think the whole idea of uh, them deciding that we're gonna have three different storytellers and we're gonna basically play a game of pass the baton, like, or actually maybe a more adequate comparison is that whisper game where like one person says
telephone.
something and it passes on to the next person, passes it on to the next person. All of a sudden, it ends up being a different thing by the end of it. Uh, Maybe that could be a better comparison, but like I think that was always an execution that would have ended in like a little bit of disjointed vision, because you just simply have three different people telling a story, unless you really sat them all three of them down and said, okay, we're going to tell this singular story. Um, and I'm not saying there wasn't that, but I think it was a very messy process that we eventually still don't really know exactly what happened. We have bits and pieces, but yeah. I love the sequel trilogy. I will never
Right.
say that is a consistent kind of experience, though. So
Abrams did not write Snoke probably think he was going to die.
no,
Probably, maybe, I don't know.
I mean, yeah,
I don't know what J.J. Abrams thought Snoke's future was going to be. I don't know what he. We know that Kylo was going to be evil at the end, and they
we know
changed
Kylo
that.
was gonna be evil, and that Kylo was gonna die evil, like regardless of like. I mean, maybe Ryan Johnson had different plans, but like uh, when it was Colin Trevorrow, he was still gonna die evil. So at least until pretty early on, Kylo was always going to die evil, or not die evil. Sorry, just die. I think.
He was always going to die. That was that's
Yeah.
certainly.
Sorry, not evil, not evil. Because he always had a turn eventually, but like for JJ, I think he was going to die evil. I think because he had that reverse Vader arc of deciding to be evil. So
For what I've always kind of gathered just through my sleuthing of various things I can find on the interwebs,
uh-huh.
is Colin's first draft, die evil, the bad guy, the villain.
Right.
Later drafts, lighten it up. Eventually just add a new villain so that Kylo can have someone who's like, here's the pure evil character, and then there's
Yeah.
Kylo, kind of the conflicted one.
Right.
And then Colin gets out, and my guess is keep that kind of Kylo softening going.
Right.
And JJ's like, for the true evil villain, let's just bring back Palpatine so we don't have to do a
Right.
lot of legwork for a new villain.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. That's also kind of how I think it went about. So
But no, I love the viewing thing because I think it. I mean, again, I think I like that more from like thematic standpoint as well.
that's fair. Yeah.
Because like we can talk about Star Wars on the whole, like we do on the show. I mean, that's kind of the point. We are Ion Canon. What does Star Wars as a singular story made up of a bajillion stories try to make? And those kind of questions of like in the grand narrative of Star Wars, was Anakin redeemed? Because that's sort of the more complicated question compared to what I can say in the original trilogy. Yes. In the sequels, I mean, he's not really that important.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, it also depends who you ask in terms of what creative you ask. Because I know there are a few creatives that I remember they were under maybe some hot water under Twitter for not really liking Anakin Skywalker as a character, or at least has always seen him as a very bad character.
People don't like Raylo, and people who do. So it's like,
yeah. So and I remember, like, not to bring up old drama or anything, but I remember whenever there was like a certain creator who made comments regarding Anakin Skywalker, there were people saying, "Oh, this person who hates Anakin Skywalker shouldn't be allowed to write for Star Wars." And that brings up the question, like, who should be allowed to write for Star Wars? Should it be someone who completely agrees with everything that Star Wars puts down, or could it be someone with a different perspective that maybe we want to explore in a book? Yeah, let's. Excuse
so
me.
I'm a big
Let's have a
hypocrite when
perspective
it
with
comes
that.
to that
Oh yeah.
myself,
Okay.
because on the one hand, I don't really mind.
Uh-huh.
Because like I'm someone who's like, I don't care about George Lucas' vision. If you want to say the Jedi are bad, or may not go that far, but like if you want to say the Jedi are flawed, go for it,
Yeah.
Sophie Hedlund. So go for it for her. But I will be the first person to lose. Let me not lose my cool. I'm not that kind of person. But I will not be happy if Zack Snyder ever does a Star Wars or writes a Star Wars. I will not be happy. I dealt with BVS that destroyed Warner Brothers.
Right.
And I will keep him. He is not a good fit for Star Wars.
Right.
Or Michael Bay.
You know who wrote that though?
That's true. But I blame. But see, I like Chris Terrio with J.J. Abrams. I don't like Chris Terrio with Zack Snyder, and Snyder has more influence on that script.
For sure. Yeah.
And Man of Steel. So I don't like. So
that's that. Okay, no, that's fair. I'm also pretty iffy on a lot of Zack Snyder stuff. I do like his Watchmen. I like his Watchmen movies. His one Watchmen movie. I like. So.
Oh, it's also weird because I know a lot of people don't like Patty Jenkins either, and well, I mean, who knows? He wrote Watchmen, but I guess that's sort of. I mean, I guess that, but I guess that's also kind of where my hypocrisy comes in, because sort of well, if you're doing this side thing, maybe, But I guess that also, I'm sorry I keep expanding the topic. We'll wrap up, but I just
No,
think I
that's
want to
okay.
talk
That's
about
okay.
this window thing in the context of this.
Mhm.
Does Star Wars? I've heard people talk about this. Should it have a thematic tapestry though? Right? Like, what are we? What? How does each installment contribute to the wider thematics of Star Wars? And
Right.
right, like this has never happened. It probably will never happen. But it's like, you know, what if a movie happened that says, "Oh no, Jedi are evil and Sith are good." Like
Right.
no, the
Yeah.
Sith are the good guys. Should we? That's
Mhm.
going to affect the thematic tapestry of Star Wars,
No, yeah,
or
for sure.
do we view it like, well, in this little portal, Sith are the good guys for some reason. I mean, I guess give me a good reason why. But
Yeah.
I do wonder if like an overarching thematic tapestry should have at least thematic consistency, right? Like, Matthew and I talked about this with
Yeah,
Acolyte,
like
where
yeah, uh-huh.
even though May and Osha, not May, well, yeah, May and Osha and Kymir are going to be these nuanced Darksiders, I see the Plagueis cameo. I mean, he sees the Plagueis cameo, and I agree with him, of like reminding us, the audience, like, Darkseid's still not good. This is
Yeah.
what the pure Darkseid still looks like. It's evil, spindly Plagueis.
Yeah.
Of And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Like, even with different kind of
Mhm.
views, there should still be some thematic consistency somewhere.
Right. I mean, I kind of I guess it really does just depend, doesn't it? Cuz like yeah, I'm totally down to have a narrative from a Sith point of view, but I do think there has to be a reminder of like, hey, the Sith is representative of this like dark hole that people can kind of go down if they continue to like be dictated by these negative emotions. Like that is literally what the dark side is, and like metaphorically too. So and I'm also kind of think about like what's her name, Karen Travis, right?
Oh yeah.
I haven't read a single one of her books, but I have heard that she didn't paint the Jedi in the best of light, and like that's fine. Like that's nothing. Like there have been people that have written the Jedi in not the best light either, but or have even
Maybe
shown it. But
Acolyte kind of does it deserves it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But to kind of say that like the Jedi are the bad guys of the galaxy, like I'm not sure if those books do that. Um, but like I it would really be like I think there's a line that it could be pushed maybe too far in that regard. Um,
Legends had those problems, I think.
Legends had those problems. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So yeah, no, I think I do think it depends on what is being talked about. Because like I mean, let's go the most extreme we can ever get. Like, what if some writer says, "I'm gonna tell a story about how the Empire were the good guys," and it's like, okay, I want to see your browser history, please. Can you show that? Like,
Yeah.
I'd be worried about that creative, but yeah, like I don't think we would ever do that because for one, I think that's super irresponsible and like that goes against what Star Wars has always stood for. So,
Yeah, I mean, Legends, Tim Zahn came close a couple times.
oh my god,
I
it
mean,
is
he
not
never outright said the Empire were the
Thrawn,
good guys,
right?
but
Thrawn.
he has gone a lot. But there are some of his later stuff where there's literally like,
Mm,
Thrawn's like, oh, the problem are these corrupt
right,
Moths
right.
or the Emperor invaders,
Yeah,
weird wizardry. We just gotta, like, they're the problems.
that's
But it's,
interesting.
it's the honorable soldier and the fleet that are just trying to
Yeah,
keep it all together.
right, right, right.
Um, got more that way later on. The original Thrawn trilogy is much better.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. I'm curious to read some of that stuff. Is it like Outbound Flight or whatever? And
Outbound, there are more choices of one.
choices of
Outbound
one.
Flight, a little
Okay.
bit.
Is that the Mara
Uh,
Jade one?
yeah, choice of one is the
Yeah.
Mara Jade one, and
Okay.
the Thrawn duology, where there's a little bit like, oh, here's Honorable Pelion now in charge of the Empire, and
That's right.
we've shed
Yeah.
the dark wizardry stuff.
Right. We don't do
So
slavery anymore, right?
yeah, no, we don't do that. The army's good. We got the good army.
Yeah.
It's a good army. It's like Legends had definitely a lot of that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
kind of by the end.
Interesting. Very
Uh,
interesting.
so it has gone in that direction. So it's sort of like, and those were those particular authors, even though some of them were like, oh no, the Empire's so bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, that's
I
fun.
do, but I also do think that, and we talk about creative freedom. I do think we look again with Colin Trevorrow, Lucasfilm does care at least to thematic consistency. I think
Yeah, no doubt. For sure.
because
Yeah,
even
yeah,
if
yeah.
it's probably more like lore stuff, it's like, oh, I don't care. Palpatine comes back or afraid Palpatine. That doesn't bother us.
Yeah, I mean, I have no proof of this, and I don't want to sound like any of those people that just make up stuff online, and but I wouldn't be surprised if one of the decisions to not go with the Trevorrow stuff was like someone who really knows the lore of the Force, saw that and was like, "Hey, Miss Kennedy, I just want to let you know, like this,
Dave.
no." Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't want to be the one to be like, "Oh, Dave Filoni stopped it," but like, if someone internally was like, "Hey, we know how the Force has been depicted in the past, and this is really earing on the idea that like the
Gray Jedi.
gray Jedi stuff, and like that's just not really compatible with what exactly we have established already." I like, and who knows? Maybe it wasn't Dave, maybe it was, but like I could
The
see that
powers
happening.
that be, I call
The
it.
powers that be, someone spoke up, and I feel like that could have been a contributing factor. I'm not even saying it was the reason; it just a contributing factor to them saying, "Okay, we no longer want to work with Trevorrow." Yeah. So
Right.
I could see that.
But yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, I'm trying to think of. I think we're pretty much done. I mean, unless you
I
have like
think
any last
so.
points you want to think about in terms of canon, multimedia.
No.
I feel like we talked about canon. I feel I'm so sorry. I feel like we got off the topic of multimedia.
Well, I mean, it kind of all bleeds into each other. I feel like
Yeah.
the whole topic of transmedia, multimedia, it eventually comes into the concept of consistency within the narrative of one narrative. Um,
Right.
yeah, so no, I think we were on topic entirely. I talked about everything I wanted to talk about. I got to mention Lego Star Wars, one of my
Yeah.
favorite things. I got to talk about that Twitter thread, so I'm pretty good. I think we talked a great deal about a great many things.
Agreed.
Yes,
Yes, but yeah, I think with that we shall begin to wrap things up for this week.
absolutely,
Thank you, Omar, for coming on for being our guest co-host while Matthew's on vacation.
absolutely. I had such a fun time. I honestly, I was like, oh, no way we could get to like 2.5 hours, but yes, we did. Yes, we
Don't
did.
underestimate my ability to
I
drag out the
know.
conversation.
No, no, but it was good. It was awesome. It was a great conversation. One of my favorite topics. So I'm always happy to be on this podcast because I know a lot of our interests align. So it's always a good time. So thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I had a blast. Again, Star Wars. I think it's the only franchise right now that has really embraced this transmedia thing. Very
Yeah,
curious to see if Avatar or James Gunn's DCU is gonna try and beat it.
yeah,
As that kind of gets off the ground. Um, I hope those Avatar does. I think Avatar could probably get the best. It is sort of
yeah,
cartoon Star Wars.
for sure, for sure.
It's time. But again, thank you everybody. Omar, where can they find you? And plugs away.
Yes, you can find me here at the Negotiator 95 on X, Twitter. I can't believe I called it X on Twitter. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can find me there. You can find me at the Negotiator on TikTok and YouTube. I haven't created anything in a while. I've actually been slowly cooking on a Mandoverse video. I've
Yes.
for pretty much almost a year now. Like, I've been on this show multiple times and I've plugged it every single time. But there's a Mandoverse show that is currently being made. It is about 80% done. So hey, I'm crossing fingers that this is the last time I plug it on this show. So
I part of me hopes that you'll have to do one more rewrite
one
just
more.
because my hope is this weekend John Favreau pops up for like 5 seconds on D23. It's like, oh yeah, we're filling the Mando movie. Yeah, bye.
No,
Bye.
no, I have to do another rewrite and I have to do more added audio segments to it. My editor's gonna hate me. But no, I'd be happy to get any information like that. So yeah,
Yeah, that'd be great. Looking
absolutely.
forward to the next week myself. Or this week actually. Of course, I guess you can follow Matthew at nuke485 at NUG485 on Twitter, on Instagram, MNEUG1138. Of course, you can follow me at JID2021, again, JID2021 on Twitter, where I talk about random stuff all the time. And of course, you can follow me at the Ion Canon Pod, EYEONCANONPOD, where on Wednesday we'll hopefully have Tractor Beam, so you will get to see Matthew again doing that. And hopefully Matthew will be back by the end of the month or next month in September. Yeah, because he might be back for the end of the month of the con, I don't remember. But yeah. So anyway, thank you everybody. Thank you, Omar. And
Yeah.
let's blow this thing and head home.
Bye.